Sergeant First Class Danny Kowalsski grabbed the clipboard out of her hands right in front of everyone. He didn't ask. He didn't hesitate. He just reached over, snatched the mission briefing document she was holding, and said loud enough for the whole room to hear, "These files aren't for tourists, sweetheart. Go find yourself a coffee and let the adults work." The room exploded with laughter. These weren't just any soldiers. These were 23 of America's most elite Special Operator SEALs, Rangers, and Delta Force members, the kind of men who lived in the shadows and breathed fire for a living. And all of them were laughing at one quiet woman standing near the door. She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She just looked at him with those calm, unreadable eyes and said nothing. And that silence, that one moment of absolute stillness, was the beginning of something none of them would ever forget. It was the kind of cold that gets into your bones and stays there, a persistent, gnawing chill that laughs at thermal layers and high-tech gear. Forward Operating Base Rhino sat tucked against the base of a jagged mountain range in eastern Afghanistan, a place where the earth itself seemed hostile to human life. In the early morning hours of a Tuesday in late November, the wind came down off those peaks like something alive, something mean, something that had been waiting all night for a reason to hurt somebody. The base itself was a collection of reinforced concrete structures, sandbag walls, satellite dishes, and portable generators humming loud enough to drown out any conversation that wasn't shouted. Guard towers stood at each corner of the perimeter, and the men inside them wore every piece of gear they owned, yet they still felt the cold like a serrated blade between the ribs. Beyond the wire, the mountains rose in every direction, gray, enormous, and entirely indifferent to the tiny dramas playing out at their feet. The men stationed at FOB Rhino were not ordinary soldiers. They were the ones who didn't talk about what they did at family reunions. They were the ones whose deployment records contained more redacted lines than readable text, the ghosts who had been to places that didn't appear on any official map and had performed deeds that would never be officially acknowledged. Master Sergeant Calvin Reed was a legend in his own right, boasting 13 combat deployments across 4 different theaters of war. He had the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen the end of the world and decided it wasn't for him. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb had survived 2 ambushes that his commanding officer later described as statistically unsurvivable, earning him a reputation for being impossible to kill. Then there was Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Cross, who had personally planned and executed over 40 direct action missions against high-value targets across Iraq, Afghanistan, and 3 other countries he was not legally permitted to name in any document. These were men who had been tested by actual war, actual darkness, and actual death, and they had come back standing. They took themselves seriously because the world had given them very good reasons to. Which is exactly why, when the dusty white truck came rolling through the main gate at 0610 hours that Tuesday morning, the reaction from the men of FOB Rhino was immediate and predictable. A single woman climbed out of the passenger seat carrying nothing but a worn canvas bag over one shoulder. She wore no body armor, no military credentials clipped to her jacket, no visible weapon, and no rank insignia. She looked like someone you might pass in a grocery store or see sitting in a quiet corner of a library. The laughter started small, like a spark in dry brush. Private First Class Tommy Garrett, 22 years old and only 3 months into his first deployment, was the first one to vocalize the collective confusion. He was standing near the motor pool with 2 other junior soldiers, his breath puffing out in white clouds. When he spotted her climbing out of that truck, this small, unremarkable woman in worn jeans and a faded olive jacket, he elbowed the guy next to him. "The Pentagon sent us a social worker," he joked. "Maybe we need a feelings check-in or something." His buddy laughed, and the third guy laughed even harder. The mockery spread the way things always spread on a small base, where boredom is a constant, suffocating companion. It moved fast and without much thought. By the time she had walked 20 steps toward the command building, at least a dozen men had noticed her, and the commentary was already moving through the base like a low electric current. They speculated she was someone's girlfriend, or perhaps a member of the press, or worse, one of those Pentagon oversight people sent to micromanage their every move. "She's definitely a babysitter," one voice muttered. She heard every word. You could tell she heard because there was something in the way she walked. She didn't speed up to escape the voices, nor did she slow down to confront them. She didn't look around to find the source of the derision. She walked like someone who had entered rooms like this 1,000 times before, rooms full of people who had already decided who she was before she ever opened her mouth. She walked like someone who had learned long ago that other people's opinions were just background noise, as irrelevant as the hum of the generators. Her name was not on the manifest. That was the first thing that bothered Sergeant First Class Danny Kowalsski. As the man who ran logistics and security clearances for incoming personnel, Kowalski took his responsibilities with a deadly seriousness. He was 37 years old, built like a man who had spent 2 decades carrying heavy things over broken terrain, and he had a particular burning hatred for paperwork that didn't add up. He intercepted her just outside the command building, his frame casting a long shadow over her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice not yet unfriendly but carrying a heavy weight of skepticism. "I need to see your credentials and your authorization paperwork before you go any further." She stopped and reached into the canvas bag, pulling out a single sealed manila envelope. She handed it to him without a word. Kowalski opened it, scanned the first page and then the second. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of something that wasn't quite confusion, yet wasn't quite concern. "This is classified at a level I don't have clearance to verify on site," he grunted. "I know," she replied calmly. "You'll need to call Colonel Hargrove directly." Kowalski stared at her, trying to read the blank slate of her face. "You know the Colonel." "We've never met," she said, "but he's expecting the call." There was a long, heavy pause. Kowalski looked back down at the envelope and then back up at her. In that moment, he looked like a man who had been very confident about the world 15 seconds ago and was now significantly less sure of his footing. "Wait here," he ordered. "Of course," she said. He disappeared inside. She waited. She didn't check her phone, she didn't shift her weight, and she didn't fidget. She just stood there in the biting cold, completely still, watching the gray mountains. When Kowalski returned 4 minutes later, something about his posture had changed. He wasn't standing at attention, but he was close to it. Whatever Hargrove had told him over the secure line had stripped away his bravado. "You're cleared for the briefing room," he said, his voice lower and more measured. "Thank you, Sergeant," she said, walking past him. Kowalski watched her go, and for just a brief second his face betrayed an unsettled expression that his peers wouldn't have understood. The classified mission briefing was scheduled for 0800 hours. By 0750, every seat in the room was filled with operators who represented the absolute peak of American military capability. These were not men who were easily impressed. They were the men who impressed each other, and even that was a rare occurrence. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Cross stood at the front of the room, positioned next to a projection screen showing topographic maps of the Kunar province. Cross was 44, with graying temples and the lean, economical build of a man who had never stopped training. He possessed a quiet authority that didn't need to shout to be heard. When he spoke, the room went silent because his rank had been bought and paid for in blood. "Gentlemen," Cross began, but he paused as the door opened. The quiet woman in the olive jacket walked in and took a seat in the back corner. Every head in the room turned. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds before Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb spoke up. "Excuse me, ma'am, but I think you might have the wrong building." His voice was polite, even friendly, delivered with the certainty of a man who believed he was helping a lost tourist. Several men around him chuckled. "I don't believe I do," she said, the friendliness in Webb's voice sharpened. "This is a classified special operations briefing. You'd need top-level clearance just to see the door to this room." "I know," she replied. "I have it." Cross didn't wait for Webb to respond. "She's cleared. She stays." He said it with a finality that ended the conversation, but it didn't stop the glances. The operators exchanged wordless looks that asked, "Asterisk, who is she? Why is she here? And does someone want to explain this to the rest of us?" Asterisk Cross clicked to the first slide, a satellite image of a fortified compound nestled in a mountain valley. 17 days ago, Cross said, his voice echoing in the small room, 3 American aid workers were taken by a network operating out of this compound near the Pakistani border. Intelligence confirms all 3 are still alive. They will not remain so indefinitely. He clicked to a slide showing topographic data and elevation markers. The compound sits in a natural bowl between 2 ridge lines. The terrain makes a vehicular approach impossible without immediate detection. Any assault team going in on foot will be exposed for approximately 400 meters before they reach the outer wall. The next slide showed wind speed data and atmospheric conditions. The only viable approach requires sniper overwatch from this ridge line. Cross pointed to a spot on the map 1,400 meters from the compound's eastern wall. The altitude and the conditions include winds gusting to 40 kilometers per hour and near-zero visibility due to constant cloud cover. It is, for all intents and purposes, an impossible shot. 1,400 meters, Master Sergeant Calvin Reed repeated, his voice thoughtful. In those conditions at night, that's not a shot, that's a prayer. That's why we need someone who doesn't pray for shots, Cross said. We need someone who calculates them. The problem was apparent to everyone. FOB Rhino had excellent snipers. Reed was qualified to 1,000 meters, and 2 SEALs had confirmed kills at 1,100. But 1,400 meters at night in the swirling mountain winds of Afghanistan was a different universe of difficulty. It required a level of expertise that very few people on the planet possessed. Cross looked around the room, meeting the eyes of his best shooters. No one spoke. The risk of missing was too high. A single stray bullet would alert the compound and result in the immediate execution of the hostages. Then, from the back corner, came a quiet voice. "I'll take the shot." The laughter that followed was a mix of genuine surprise and condescending disbelief. It was the kind of laughter that comes when something so absurd happens that the brain doesn't know how else to react. But some of it, like Kowalski's, was cruel. Some of the younger operators, those with the most to prove, let their laughter linger, making sure she knew she was the joke. She waited with the patience of a mountain. When the noise finally died down, she spoke again, her voice as level as a horizon. "I'm not joking." "With respect, ma'am," Webb said, his voice now professionally dismissive. "A 1,400-meter shot in these conditions requires a long-range precision shooter with verified combat experience. I don't know who you are, but you don't have the resume for this." "My name is on the mission attachment," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "The one marked level 4 classified. You should read it." Webb looked at Cross, who was watching the woman with a peculiar, focused intensity. "What's your background?" Cross asked. "That information is classified above your current clearance level," she replied. The room bristled. You could feel the collective ego of the elite operators tightening. Reed leaned forward, his face hard. "Ma'am, I've been shooting at distance for 19 years. I have 42 confirmed long-range engagements. The shot you're describing is not something I would take with any degree of confidence." "What makes you think you can?" "Because I've taken it," she said. "Multiple times, in worse conditions." She said it so simply, without a hint of bravado or performance, that the room was momentarily stunned into silence. Reed stared at her for a long time, looking for a tell, a flicker of a lie. He found nothing. Finally, he looked at Cross. "Prove it," Reed challenged. Cross checked his watch. "Range, 1,600 hours. Kowalski stood up so fast his chair screeched against the floor. "Sir, with respect." 1,600 hours, Cross repeated. The meeting was over. Word of the challenge spread across the base like wildfire. By 1545, 47 men had gathered at the long-range firing range on the eastern edge of the base. Marines, SEALs, Rangers, and support personnel who had no reason to be there showed up because they knew they were about to witness something historic, one way or the other. Money was changing hands. Tommy Garrett had $50 riding on the bet that she wouldn't even hit the paper. The atmosphere was charged with a mixture of skepticism and a strange, budding curiosity. The targets were set at 800, 1,000, and 1,200 meters. No one had even bothered to set up a target at 1,400 because the consensus was that she wouldn't make it past the first marker. She arrived at the range at exactly 1,600, carrying a matte black rifle case with no manufacturer markings. She set it on the shooting bench and opened it. Inside was a rifle that several of the more experienced operators didn't recognize, a highly customized, long-range precision instrument designed for shots that standard military hardware couldn't handle. The murmurs started immediately. "Where did she get that? That's not standard issue." Reed stood in the back, arms crossed, watching her every move. He had stopped laughing hours ago. There was a methodical, practiced grace to the way she handled her gear, no wasted motion, no hesitation. She settled behind the rifle, adjusted the bipod, and made 2 tiny corrections to the scope. She checked the wind indicator once, twice, 3 times, then she went completely still. The entire crowd of 47 men went silent. The first shot broke the air like a thunderclap. The spotter at 800 meters clicked his radio. "Hit. Center mass." The crowd didn't react much. 800 meters was a standard distance for these men. She didn't move, didn't celebrate. She already had the next round chambered. Asterisk crack, asterisk hit, center mass. Then a third. The spotter took a long moment before his voice came over the radio, sounding a bit breathless. 3 rounds, same hole, 800 meters. The collective intake of breath from the crowd was audible. Tommy Garrett's $50 suddenly felt very precarious. Without being asked, she shifted her focus to the 1,000-meter target. The wind had picked up, swirling in irregular gusts that made a mockery of simple ballistics. She watched the range flags for 45 seconds, her body becoming a part of the earth beneath her. Then she fired. Hit, the spotter said. Hit again. Another pause. Sir, I need you to confirm I'm seeing this correctly. It's another identical grouping, at 1,000 meters, in this wind. Reed unfolded his arms. He moved through the crowd, picking up a spotting scope to see for himself. He looked through the glass for a long time before lowering it. His face wasn't the face of a man who had been proven wrong. It was the face of a man who was witnessing a miracle. There is a difference between being an expert and being a master, and Reed realized he was looking at the latter. She shifted to 1,200 meters. The atmosphere on the range had transformed from mockery to a heavy, reverent silence. This was the distance where the men were separated from the legends. The wind gusted hard, a lateral push that should have sent the bullet feet off target. She fired. Hit, the spotter whispered. Dead center. She had read the gust and compensated for it in the fraction of a second before pulling the trigger. Reed stepped toward her. How long have you been shooting? He asked quietly. She didn't look up immediately. She was already adjusting her scope for a distance that wasn't even on the range. When she finally looked at him, her eyes held the weight of 1,000 lifetimes. Long enough, she said. The men who had come to watch her fail were now standing in the posture of students. The money was forgotten. The jokes were buried, but they still didn't know who she was. They didn't know about the middle-of-the-night calls from 4-star generals or the missions that had changed the course of history without ever being recorded. They didn't know she was a ghost, a shadow who appeared when the impossible needed to be done and vanished before the praise could be given. Cross walked to the front and stood beside her. He looked at the 1,200-meter target and then back at her. Tomorrow night, he said, 2,100 hours, full mission planning, you're our primary. One more thing, Cross added. I need your full credentials for the official log. Whatever clearance I need, I'll get it. She reached into her bag and handed him a second, thicker envelope. Cross opened it, and as he read the first page, a look of profound realization crossed his face. A look that Reed, standing nearby, would never forget. Cross closed the envelope quickly, his eyes reflecting a new kind of respect. That night, no one at FOB Rhino slept well. Tommy Garrett lay on his bunk, thinking about the casual cruelty of his laughter and the $50 he would gladly pay just to take it back. Marcus Webb sat at his desk, staring at a map but seeing only the woman's calm eyes. And Kowalski. Kowalski was thinking about the clipboard he had snatched, feeling the weight of an apology he didn't know how to give. Outside, the woman stood by the perimeter wire, looking at the dark, jagged teeth of the mountains. She wasn't thinking about the men or their laughter. She was thinking about the 1,400 meters of cold air between a ridge line and a compound. She was thinking about the wind and the rotation of the earth. She was already solving the problem because there were people in those mountains who were counting on her, and she had never once let a target walk away. The cold wind roared down from the peaks, but she didn't feel it. She was already the wind. She was already the bullet. She was the silent answer to a prayer no one had dared to speak aloud. And as the stars burned quietly above the clouds, FOB Rhino prepared for a mission that would redefine everything they knew about courage, skill, and the quiet power of a woman who didn't need a name to be a hero. The air inside the barracks that night felt different, heavy with the realization that the hierarchy of the base had been silently dismantled by a woman who didn't even have a rank. The men who prided themselves on being the toughest, the smartest, and the most capable were suddenly confronted with the fact that they were second best. It wasn't an easy pill to swallow. For men like Webb and Kowalski, their identity was tied to their status as the elite. To see a civilian, a woman they had dismissed as a tourist, outperform them so effortlessly was a shock to the system. In the shadows of the motor pool, Garrett and his friends sat in silence. The jokes were gone, replaced by a brooding reflection. Did you see that last shot? One of them whispered. The wind was howling and she didn't even blink. I saw it, Garrett replied, his voice tight. I saw all of it. He was thinking about his mother, a woman who had raised 3 kids on her own and never complained, never asked for help, and never backed down. He realized he had looked at the woman in the olive jacket and seen a target for his boredom, rather than the warrior she clearly was. He felt a deep, burning shame that no amount of cold Afghan wind could chill. Meanwhile, in his office, Lieutenant Colonel Cross was still staring at the documents in the thick envelope. He had seen a lot of things in his career: Black Ops, CIA paramilitaries, Tier 1 operators from every branch. But he had never seen a file like this. There were no names, only code words, no locations, only coordinates, and the list of commendations was long enough to cover a wall, all of them posthumous or classified. It became clear to him that the woman sitting in the back of his briefing room wasn't just a shooter. She was the ultimate fail-safe. When the best of the best failed, she was the one they called to fix the mess. He thought back to the phone call with Colonel Hargrove. Hargrove's voice had been uncharacteristically hushed, almost reverent. "If she's there, Cross, give her whatever she wants. Don't ask questions, and for God's sake, don't get in her way. She's the reason half the men in this theater are still breathing." Cross leaned back in his chair, the green glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows. He knew the mission was a gamble. The hostages were being held by a group that didn't negotiate, a group that thrived on chaos and cruelty. The 1,400-meter shot wasn't just a tactical necessity. It was the only way to keep the rescue team from being slaughtered before they even reached the gates. And now, he had the one person in the world who could actually make that shot. The next morning, the base felt like a coiled spring. The mission was a go. The rescue team, including Reed, Webb, and a handful of others, met in the briefing room at 2100 hours. This time, when the woman walked in, no one laughed. No one said a word. They moved aside to give her a seat at the table. Cross laid out the final plan. The insertion would be via helicopter, dropping the team 5 miles out to avoid acoustic detection. They would move through the broken terrain under the cover of darkness, reaching the ridge line by 0300. The woman would take her position, and the team would wait for her signal. "Once the sentries are down," Cross explained, "you have a 90-second window to breach the eastern wall and secure the hostages. If the alarm goes off before you're inside, the mission is a failure." Reed looked at the woman. "The wind is projected to be even worse tonight. High-altitude gusts, possible snow." "I've accounted for it," she said. Her voice was steady like a heartbeat. Webb, who had been quiet for most of the meeting, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, about yesterday, in the briefing, I was out of line." She looked at him, and for the first time, a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of her mouth. "You were doing your job, Chief. You were protecting your team. I wouldn't expect anything less." The tension in Webb's shoulders visibly relaxed. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a start. It was a recognition of mutual respect, the kind that can only be earned in the presence of true competence. The mission began under a moonless sky. The helicopter ride was a blur of vibration and cold air, the interior of the bird lit only by the faint green glow of night vision goggles. They dropped into the valley, the silence of the mountains swallowing them whole as soon as the rotors faded into the distance. The hike was brutal. The terrain was a vertical maze of loose rock and frozen mud, every step a gamble. But the woman moved through it like a shadow, her rifle case strapped to her back, her breathing rhythmic and controlled. She didn't struggle, didn't lag behind. She set a pace that even the seasoned operators found challenging. By 0245, they reached the ridge line. The compound was visible in the distance, a cluster of flickering lights in the dark bowl of the valley. The wind was a physical force now, screaming across the ridge and biting at their exposed skin. The woman moved to the edge, finding a natural notch in the rock that provided a clear line of sight to the compound. She unpacked her rifle with the same methodical grace she had shown at the range. Reed settled in beside her as her spotter. He adjusted his scope, squinting against the wind. "Range, 1,412 meters. Wind, 20 knots from the north-northwest, gusting to 35. Pressure is dropping." "Copy," she whispered. She was prone now, her body fused with the rock. She adjusted her scope, her fingers moving with surgical precision. She wasn't just looking at the target, she was feeling the environment. She was listening to the wind, reading the way it swirled around the rocks, calculating the density of the air. The rest of the team was already moving down the slope, ghosting toward the 400-meter mark. They were exposed, vulnerable. If she missed, they were dead. "2 sentries on the eastern gate," Reed whispered. "1 on the roof, they're moving." "I have them," she said. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. She waited for the perfect moment, the tiny window where the wind gust and the target's movement aligned with her heartbeat. Asterisk crack. Asterisk the sound was suppressed, a dull thud that was lost in the roar of the wind. Through his scope, Reed saw the sentry on the roof collapse without a sound. Asterisk crack. Asterisk the first gate guard went down. Asterisk crack. Asterisk the second guard followed. 3 shots, 3 kills in less than 5 seconds. At 1,400 meters. In a gale, clear, she said into her comms. The rescue team surged forward, a blur of motion against the gray stone. They reached the wall, the breach charge muffled by the distance. Within minutes, the radio crackled with the words everyone had been waiting for. Hostages secured, moving to extraction. The woman didn't move. She stayed behind her rifle, her eyes scanning the compound for any sign of movement, any threat to the team. She remained there until the helicopter's silhouette appeared on the horizon, picking up the team and the aid workers. Only then did she begin to pack her gear. Back at FOB Rhino, the mood was one of quiet triumph. The aid workers were being treated in the med tent, and the operators were cleaning their gear, the adrenaline finally beginning to recede. But their eyes kept drifting to the woman who was sitting by herself near the command building, her canvas bag once again over her shoulder. Kowalski walked up to her, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He held out the clipboard he had snatched the day before. "I believe this is yours," he said, his voice rough. She took it from him, her eyes meeting his. "Thank you, Sergeant. I wanted to say. I was wrong," Kowalski managed to get out. "I didn't know who I was talking to. It doesn't matter who I am," she said quietly. "What matters is that those people are going home." She stood up and walked toward the white truck that was waiting to take her back to the airstrip. As she climbed into the passenger seat, the men of FOB Rhino did something they had never done for a civilian. They stood at attention. From the youngest private to the most seasoned master sergeant, they offered a silent salute to the woman who had shown them that true strength doesn't need to shout, and that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one you least expect. As the truck pulled away, disappearing into the dust and the morning light, Master Sergeant Reed turned to Cross. "Do you think we'll ever see her again?" Cross looked at the mountains, the gray peaks now bathed in a pale, golden glow. "I hope not," he said. "Because if we see her again, it means the world is in trouble, and she's the only one who can save it." The story of the silent shooter of Rhino would become a legend among the special operations community, a tale whispered in darkened hangars and around flickering campfires. But the woman herself remained a mystery, a ghost who had stepped out of the shadows for one impossible moment and then vanished back into the silence of the mountains. She didn't want the fame, the medals, or the recognition. She just wanted to do the job. And in the end, that was the most elite thing of all. The bass returned to its usual rhythm, but the air felt lighter, as if the weight of their own arrogance had been lifted. The men of FOB Rhino were still the best in the world, but they carried themselves with a new kind of humility. They knew now that out there, somewhere in the vast, unforgiving world, there were others, quiet, unremarkable people who possessed skills beyond their imagination. And they knew that the next time someone walked through their gates, they wouldn't laugh. They would wait, they would watch, and they would remember the woman in the olive jacket who had conquered the wind and the mountains with nothing but a rifle and a quiet heart. As the weeks turned into months, the memory of that Tuesday morning didn't fade. It only grew stronger. Tommy Garrett eventually finished his deployment and went home, but he never forgot the lesson he learned at the range. He became a better soldier, a better man, because he realized that true respect isn't given to the loudest voice or the biggest muscles. It's earned through actions, through discipline, and through the quiet pursuit of excellence. And somewhere, in a room far away from the dust of Afghanistan, a woman sat in a quiet corner of a library, a book in her hand and a worn canvas bag at her feet. She looked like anyone else, a tourist in the world of ordinary things. But her eyes still held the stillness of the ridge line and her hands still knew the weight of a rifle. She was ready. She was always ready, because the world is a dangerous place and sometimes it needs a ghost to set things right. The cold wind still comes down off the peaks of the Kunar province and the generators still hum at FOB Rhino. The mountains remain indifferent, their gray faces watching the tiny dramas of men. But for those who were there, for those who saw the shots that couldn't be made, the mountains will always hold a secret. They will always remember the woman who came out of the cold, did the impossible, and walked away without looking back. And in the silence of the night, if you listen closely, you might still hear the echo of a single, perfect shot, ringing out across the valley like a promise kept. The aid workers she saved eventually told their stories, speaking of the terrifying darkness of their captivity and the miraculous moment when the guards simply fell, as if struck by an invisible hand. They spoke of the soldiers who burst through the walls and carried them to safety. But they never knew about the woman on the ridge. They never knew that their lives had been held in the balance of a single trigger pull 1,400 meters away. And that was exactly how she wanted it. For her, the mission wasn't about being seen. It was about being the difference between life and death. It was about the calculation, the stillness, and the unwavering commitment to a task that everyone else said was impossible. She was a master of the unseen, a guardian of the shadows, and as long as there were lives to be saved and impossible shots to be taken, she would be there. A quiet, unremarkable woman in an olive jacket, ready to change the world, one perfect shot at a time. The legacy of her visit lived on in the tactical changes implemented at the base. Sniper training was overhauled, with a newfound emphasis on reading the subtle nuances of mountain weather and the psychological preparation for extreme distance engagements. Reed himself took on the role of mentor, pushing his men to look past the impossible and focus on the achievable through discipline. He often cited the woman's performance, not as a point of comparison, but as an inspiration. There is no such thing as an impossible shot, he would tell his students. There is only a shot you haven't prepared for yet. Cross, too, found his leadership style evolving. He became more attuned to the quiet voices in his command, realizing that some of the best ideas and the most profound skills often came from those who weren't the loudest in the room. He kept the manila envelope in a secure safe in his office, a reminder of the day his perspective was shattered and rebuilt. He never shared the contents with anyone, but the knowledge that she was out there, a silent sentinel for the nation, gave him a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. Webb and Kowalski eventually became close friends, bonded by their shared experience of being humbled by the best. They often sat together in the mess hall, talking about the silent shooter and wondering where she was. She's probably in some god-forsaken jungle right now, Kowalski would say, his voice full of respect, saving someone else who doesn't even know she exists. Yeah, Webb would agree, and I bet she's still not wearing any rank. The truck that took her to the airstrip that morning eventually found its way back to the motor pool, but for Tommy Garrett, it was never just another vehicle. He made sure it was always clean, always maintained, as if it were a shrine to the woman who had taught him the most important lesson of his life. He didn't talk about it much, but every time he saw a white truck or a worn olive jacket, he felt a surge of pride. He had been there. He had seen the impossible. The mountains of Afghanistan are old, far older than the conflicts that have raged at their feet. They have seen empires rise and fall, and they will see many more before they are done. But for one brief moment in time, they played host to a master of the hunt, a woman who had mastered the art of the silent strike. And though she is gone, her spirit remains in the cold wind that blows off the peaks, a reminder that the greatest strength is often the most quiet, and the most profound impact is often the most invisible. As the years passed, the story of FOB Rhino faded from the headlines, and the base itself was eventually decommissioned. But the men who were there that Tuesday morning carried the memory with them for the rest of their lives. It became a part of their DNA, a story they told their children and grandchildren, not about a battle they won, but about a woman who showed them what it truly means to be elite. And so, the legend of the silent shooter lives on, a testament to the power of skill, the importance of humility, and the enduring mystery of those who work in the shadows to keep the world safe. She remains an enigma, a ghost in the machine of history, but for 23 of America's finest operators, she will always be the woman who snatched a clipboard, defied the wind, and saved the day without ever asking for a thank you. The sun sets over the Kunar province, casting long, purple shadows across the valleys. The generators are silent now, the concrete structures crumbling back into the dust. But if you stand on that ridge line at 0300, when the wind is howling and the clouds are low, you might just feel a presence. You might just see a shadow in the notch of the rock, a silent guardian watching over the dark. And you'll know that the impossible is only a calculation away. The aid workers, now long home, lived out their lives with a deep appreciation for the freedom they almost lost. They never knew the name of their savior, but they never forgot the feeling of being rescued from the brink of despair. In their quiet moments, they offered a silent prayer for the soldiers who came for them and for the unseen hands that cleared their path. The woman in the olive jacket continued her work, her life a series of quiet entries in a classified log. She never sought the limelight, never wrote a memoir, and never looked for promotion. She was content to be the ghost, the shadow, the silent answer to the world's most difficult problems. And in the end, that was more than enough. For her, the reward was in the success of the mission, the safety of the innocent, and the knowledge that she had done her part. The world moves on, oblivious to the battles fought in the shadows and the heroes who fight them. But every now and then, a story like this emerges, a reminder that there are those among us who possess extraordinary gifts and the courage to use them without hope of reward. They are the quiet ones, the ones we often overlook or underestimate. But when the darkness closes in and the situation seems hopeless, they are the ones we need the most. And they are always there, waiting in the shadows, ready to take the shot that no one else can make. The memory of the silent shooter is a call to all of us to look beyond the surface, to value competence over bravado, and to recognize the true nature of heroism. It's a story of a woman who didn't need to shout to be heard, and who didn't need a rank to be a leader. She was simply herself, a master of her craft, a guardian of the light, and a reminder that the impossible is only a challenge waiting to be met. And as the stars continue to burn quietly above the clouds, she remains out there, a silent sentinel in a noisy world. She is the wind on the ridge, the shadow in the notch, and the perfect shot in the dark. She is the ghost of Rhino, and her story will never be forgotten by those who were lucky enough to witness it. For in the end, the most powerful stories are the ones that are written not in ink, but in the hearts of those who were changed by them. And the story of the silent shooter is one that will be told for generations to come, a testament to the enduring power of the quiet hero. Commander Cross had spent 4 years at this level of command, navigating the treacherous waters of special operations where the stakes were measured in lives and the currency was classified information. He had seen the best the military had to offer, men who were more steel than flesh, yet nothing in his tenure had prepared him for the folder sitting on his desk. He had requested additional information through 3 separate, highly compartmentalized channels, and each time the response had been a digital wall. Need to know only. Authorization pending. Standby. It was a bureaucratic stalemate that usually signaled something either very sensitive or very dangerous. When the secure line finally chirped, the voice on the other end didn't provide a name, only a series of clipped, careful sentences that felt like they were being read from a screen that would self-destruct in minutes. The thought he kept returning to, even as the details began to spill out, was her age. She didn't look old enough to have a driver's license, let alone the record they were describing. He stared at the surveillance photo on his desk, the grainy image of the girl who had arrived at his base, and tried to reconcile the image with the data. The numbers didn't lie. The dates were etched in the cold permanence of mission logs. He was being read portions of a history he wasn't even cleared to fully see, a ghost story written in the blood of enemies and the salvation of allies. Say that last part again, Cross said, his voice a low rasp in the quiet office. The voice repeated the statistic. Cross sat back, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way it hadn't in years. How many? He asked. The voice told him. Cross put the phone down with the kind of exaggerated care you use when your hands are no longer entirely steady. He sat in the dim light of his office, staring at the wall, trying to process what it meant to be the best in the world at something that nobody officially knew you did. At 0300 hours, the base was a skeleton of its daytime self. The hum of the generators provided a low-frequency heartbeat to the silence. Reed, a veteran of 19 years who had seen every corner of the world's most miserable places, stood up from his cot. He pulled on his jacket, the fabric stiff with the cold of the high-altitude night, and walked toward the common area. He wasn't surprised to find her there. There was an instinct you developed after 2 decades in the shadow world, a way of recognizing a specific kind of mind. It was the kind of mind that never truly turned off, the kind that was always 3 steps ahead, solving the next 3 problems while the rest of the world was still struggling with the first. She was sitting at a scarred wooden table, a cup of coffee held between her palms for warmth. Spread out before her was a topographic map, but it wasn't the standard mission map they had been issued. This one was larger, more detailed, showing the sprawling, labyrinthine valley system that surrounded their target compound. Reed didn't ask for permission. He simply pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. She didn't jump. She didn't even flinch. She just looked up, her eyes clear and impossibly calm for someone her age. "You're not going to ask me to leave," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," Reed replied, his eyes dropping to the map. "Can I look?" Without a word, she rotated the paper so he could see it. Reed studied the map, his eyes tracing the lines of elevation and the jagged peaks of the ridge. He noticed the marks immediately. They were tiny, precise pencil strokes, the kind of shorthand a professional uses to turn a piece of paper into a battlefield. He recognized them because he had spent 19 years making the same marks. Sight lines, elevation changes, wind corridors. "You've already mapped the overwatch position," he noted. "I mapped 3 possible positions," she corrected him. "This one is the best." Her finger touched a spot on the ridgeline a location cross had identified during the initial briefing. Reed looked at where she was pointing, then at the 2 other spots she had rejected. "Why not these 2? The explanation came with a clinical detachment. "This one exposes you to observation from the secondary guard tower on the north wall during the first 20 minutes of infiltration. If the moon breaks the clouds, you're a silhouette against the sky. This other one," she said, moving her finger, "gives you a better angle on the eastern approach, but the ground composition at that elevation is loose shale over bedrock. The mountain wind at this distance will cause micro-vibrations through the tripod. You can't fully compensate for that, not in these conditions." Reed stared at the map. The level of detail was staggering. He reached over, picking up a pencil from the table, and made a small mark near the second position. He had suspected the vibration issue, but it would have taken him hours of physical reconnaissance to confirm it. "How long did it take you to figure that out?" he asked. "I felt it in the way the wind was moving this afternoon," she said, her voice steady. "The gusts at this base have a similar signature to what that ridge line will produce based on the canyon funneling. It's in the atmospheric data, too, if you know what to look for." Reed put the pencil down and looked at her directly. The skepticism that had defined his first 20 hours with her was beginning to erode, replaced by a growing, uncomfortable sense of awe. "Who trained you?" he asked. She wrapped her hands tighter around her coffee cup, the steam rising in the cold air. "Multiple programs. You wouldn't have direct knowledge of most of them." "Try me," Reed said, his voice dropping an octave. She looked at him, and for a moment he saw the gears turning behind her eyes. It was a cold, calculated assessment, the kind you perform when deciding whether to trust a stranger with a secret that could get you killed. "Fort Bragg," she said eventually. "Then a program that doesn't have a public name. Then 3 years attached to a unit that you definitely don't have clearance for." "That unit," Reed said, his mind racing. "Is it the one that operates out of a—" "Yes," she interrupted. Reed went quiet. A fragment of information from a classified briefing 18 months ago suddenly clicked into place. He remembered a whispered reference to a shooter assigned to a black program so compartmentalized that even the men who benefited from the results were never told who had pulled the trigger. "Syria," Reed said slowly, the word hanging in the air like a heavy mist. "Aleppo. About 3 years ago. There was an operation where 2 SEAL teams were pinned down in a building complex. The mission logs say they were extracted successfully, but the official report was missing a page. It didn't account for how the flanking positions were cleared. 6 armed positions on a rooftop 300 meters away were neutralized in under 2 minutes without the assault team ever firing a shot." He looked up from the map, searching her face for a reaction. She said nothing. She didn't have to. The silence was its own confirmation. "That was you," Reed said, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. She took a sip of her coffee, the motion fluid and calm. Reed sat back in his chair, pressing a hand over his mouth. He stared at the ceiling, the flickering fluorescent light reflecting in his eyes. When he looked at her again, his expression had shifted. It wasn't just admiration. It was the look of a man who had just discovered the map he'd been using his whole life was missing half the world. "Those men," Reed said, his voice thick. "The ones you extracted. Do they know?" "No," she said simply. "Does anyone know?" "A very small number of people with very high clearance," she replied. "That's the nature of the program." Reed leaned forward, the weight of the secret pressing down on the table between them. "How many operations?" She looked at him steadily, her gaze unblinking. "More than you would expect," she said. "But less than there should have been. There were missions I wasn't deployed on that I could have helped with." "Why weren't you?" Reed asked. Because she said, and her voice didn't harden, but it became very precise, like a scalpel. There are people in positions of authority who find it very difficult to trust a resource they didn't expect to exist. They use me when they have no other option. And when the mission succeeds, the credit is distributed in ways that don't require anyone to explain how it actually happened. The words sat on the table like a physical weight. Reed understood exactly what she was describing. He had been in the military long enough to know it wasn't a meritocracy. The machinery of recognition and official record operated on a set of assumptions that didn't always accommodate the reality of the field. He had spent his career benefiting from that machinery, earning the medals and the rank that came with visible success. He had never, until this moment, sat across from someone who had been systematically erased from the history she was writing. "That's wrong," he said. "It wasn't a judgment, it was a statement of fact." "Yes," she agreed, "it is." They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the distant hum of the bass. Finally, Reed broke the quiet. "What's your name?" "Your real name, not the file designation." She hesitated for just a second, a flicker of something human crossing her face. "Alexandra Adams," she said. "Alex." Reed repeated the name, nodding once as if confirming a long-held suspicion. "I'm Calvin," he said. "I know," she replied. "I read your record before I came here." Reed raised an eyebrow, a small smirk playing on his lips. "Should I be flattered or concerned?" "Flattered," she said. "Your long-range work in Helmand Province in 2019 was exceptional. The adjustment you made for the temperature differential at that altitude, most people would have overcorrected." Reed stared at her, his jaw dropping slightly. "That engagement is classified," he said. "I know," she replied. "I had clearance." Reed opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. Against his will, against every instinct that told him he was the senior operator, the one in charge of the evaluation, he laughed. It was a short, genuine, slightly disbelieving laugh. "Okay," he said, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Okay." In that moment, something shifted. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was the beginning of a bond that only forms between people who operate at the absolute edge of human capability. It was the relief of finally finding someone who spoke the same language. By 0600, the base began to stir. The morning shift started their cycle, the sound of boots on concrete, the smell of industrial coffee drifting through the vents, the rhythmic cycling of the generators. Alex folded her map with practiced precision and stood up. "Get some sleep," Reed said. "You too," she replied, and she meant it. She walked out of the common area with the same quiet, purposeful gait she had arrived with. Reed stayed at the table for a few minutes more, his mind back in Syria, thinking about 6 neutralized positions and 2 SEAL teams who made it home because of a ghost. He thought about the cost of being the reason things worked out without ever being allowed to be the reason. At 0645, Kowalski found him. The big man looked tired, his face lined with the stress of the upcoming op. "You talked to her?" Kowalski asked, pouring himself a cup of the sludge-like coffee. "Yeah," Reed said. Kowalski sat down, his large frame dwarfing the chair. He was quiet for a long time, staring into his cup. "I grabbed the clipboard out of her hands," he said finally. "Yesterday morning, in front of everyone." "I know," Reed said. "I heard." Kowalski wrapped his massive hands around the cup. He wasn't a man who discussed feelings or used words like regret. But the raw air of the morning and the weight of the last 24 hours had stripped away his usual defenses. "I need to fix that," he said. Reed nodded. "Yeah," he said. "You do." The 2100 briefing that night was held in the same room as the previous one, but the atmosphere had been completely recalibrated. The men filed in, taking their usual seats, but the easy, arrogant confidence of the day before had vanished. It was replaced by a sharp, focused attention. People were leaning forward, their bodies tense, eyes locked on the front of the room. When Alex walked in, she took her usual spot in the back corner. This time, nobody joked. Nobody questioned her presence. Cross began the briefing by displaying new satellite imagery of the compound. There had been a change in the guard rotation, a shift in the timing of the external patrols that created a tiny, narrow window for the assault. "The window is 11 minutes, Cross said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "If the assault team isn't at the outer wall in 11 minutes, the next patrol rotation closes the approach, and we lose the element of surprise." "What's the distance from the insertion point to the wall?" Webb asked. 420 meters, Cross replied. "Across open ground." The room went dead quiet as the operators did the mental math. 420 meters of exposed ground in 11 minutes. with a sniper overwatch position 1,400 meters away on a ridgeline in the pitch black of a mountain night. The overwatch needs to be established at least 30 minutes before the team moves, Cross continued. That means our shooter needs to be in position while it's still fully dark before the cloud cover shifts. He looked toward the back of the room and every head turned with him. Alex was already looking at the map on the screen, a small notebook open on her knee. She was scribbling numbers, her pen moving with rhythmic certainty. The 30-minute window works, she said, her voice cutting through the silence. I'll need a single support element to help carry the heavy gear to the ridgeline base. From there, I work alone. How long to establish the position once you hit the ridge? Cross asked. 12 minutes, she replied. In the dark, Cross pressed not out of doubt but for confirmation. In the dark, she said, what's your contingency if the wind shifts during the op? Webb asked, his voice professional and devoid of the previous day's skepticism. I'll be reading the wind continuously from the moment I'm set, she explained. I can compensate for gusts up to 60 kilometers per hour with holdover adjustment. Beyond that, I call the shot if the window opens between gusts. Mountain wind at this altitude is cyclical. There will be windows, and if there isn't, Webb pushed. She looked up from her notebook, her eyes locking onto his. There will be, she said. I've been in worse. The math works. Webb held her gaze for a beat, then nodded slowly. It was the nod of a professional recognizing another. In that moment, the room changed for the last time. It wasn't an explosion of realization like at the range. It was something quieter and more profound. The men stopped seeing her as a girl and started seeing her as a teammate. Cross moved into the granular details, extraction routes, radio protocols, rules of engagement. Alex asked 3 questions throughout the 2-hour briefing. Each one was surgical, targeting the exact pieces of information her role required that hadn't been addressed. The operators took note. Experience had taught them that the quality of a person's questions was the truest measure of their competence. When the briefing broke, Cross announced they were up in 18 hours. As the men filed out, Kowalski stayed in his seat. Alex was gathering her things when he called her name. Alex, he said. She looked at him. He stood up, his massive frame creating a shadow that swallowed the table. He looked deeply uncomfortable. Yesterday morning, he said, his voice gruff. The clipboard. What I said, you don't have to, she started, but he cut her off. I was wrong. What I did was wrong. I want you to know that I know that. She looked at him, not with coldness or warmth, but with a directness that saw him for exactly who he was. Okay, she said. Okay, he repeated. I appreciate it, she added, and she meant it. Kowalski watched her leave, feeling the weight of the apology still hanging in the air. He had expected to feel better, but he realized that a private apology for a public insult didn't quite balance the scales. He was still processing that when Reed found him. She accept it, Reed asked. Yeah, Kowalski said. Reed clapped him on the shoulder. Good. Now go make sure the equipment manifest is right. Kowalski almost smiled. Yeah. The final hours before an operation have a unique texture. It's not excitement, it's a narrowing of the world. Everything that doesn't involve the mission falls away. Conversations become functional. Men become quieter, more interior. Alex spent the evening in the armory performing a meticulous check of her gear. Ammunition, optics, electronics. Every piece of equipment was inspected, cleaned, and tested. Webb found her there at 2300 hours. He had been looking for a reason to talk to her all day. Can I ask you something? He asked. Sure, she said. How many times? He asked carefully. Has a room done that to you? Laughed like that? She considered it. Enough times that I stopped counting. And you still showed up, Webb said. Why? She looked at him, her expression thoughtful. Because the mission doesn't care whether the room believes in me. The people in that compound don't care. The shot either goes where it needs to go or it doesn't. Everything else is just noise. Webb nodded. I'm sorry, he said. For the briefing room. For Marcus, she said, using his first name. I'm going to cover your back out there. That's the job. We're good. Webb blinked, surprised she knew his name. How do you know that? He asked. Reed told me, she said. He also told me you put hot sauce on literally everything you eat, which I find deeply concerning. Webb laughed, a genuine, relieved sound. It's a medical condition, he joked. Concerning, she repeated, but I'll still cover you. At 0200, Cross found her outside, staring at the dark silhouette of the mountains. He stood beside her in the biting cold. Last chance to review, he said. I'm ready, she replied. Cross was quiet for a long moment. I spoke with command last night. I know more now. I know about Aleppo. I know about Iraq. I know about the 26 operations and the 26 successes. The wind whipped between them, carrying the scent of snow and pine. That's a lot of people who came home because of you and never knew it, Cross said quietly. She said nothing. Does the number matter? He asked. They came home, she said. That's what matters. Cross looked at her, a mixture of respect and guilt in his eyes. The system had used her and then erased her, and he was part of that system. Tomorrow night, he said, whatever happens, your name goes in the mission report. Your real name, your contribution on the record. She turned to look at him. They'll redact it, she said. Maybe, Cross replied, but I'll put it there. She looked back at the mountains. Thank you, she said softly. The 19 hours leading up to the assault were a masterclass in controlled tension. On FOB Rhino, every man who knew about the op was moving with a specific kind of stillness. Reed spent the morning checking radio frequencies and reviewing approach vectors for the third time. He looked at the wind data for the valley, and each time it matched the parameters Alex had described. At 1100, Webb found him. You think she slept? Webb asked. You think she needs to? Reed countered. Webb thought about it. I think she probably hasn't, and I think she's fine. Then you have your answer. They didn't speak about it further. The truth of her career sat between them, a heavy, silent presence. At 1400, Cross held the final confirmation briefing. 12 operators representing the elite of the elite sat in the room. Cross went through the timeline one last time. Insertion at 0130, foot infiltration, the 11-minute window, breach, extract, exfil. Any questions? Derek Moss, a ranger sergeant, raised his hand. Rules of engagement for Overwatch. If the team is compromised, Ghost calls it, Cross said. She has full discretionary authority. She doesn't wait for confirmation. Moss looked at the back of the room, re-evaluating the risk in real time. He nodded, more settled than before. Then Captain James Ockaffer, a man of few words, spoke up. The shot at 1600 meters. The vehicle shot. Is that a parameter or a contingency? Cross looked at Alex. Contingency, she said, but I'll take it if it opens. Ockaffer studied her. 1600 meters, moving target through the rear window. Quarter panel penetration, driver's compartment, she said. I'll need a straight line for 4 seconds. Ockaffer was silent for a long moment. I've heard of a shot like that, he said. People said it was a myth. She met his eyes, her gaze unwavering. It wasn't a myth, she said. Ockaffer looked at her for 3 full seconds, then he nodded. The briefing was over, and the countdown to the mountain had truly begun. The final few hours before the helicopters arrived were spent in the kind of silence that precedes a storm. The base felt smaller, the walls closing in as the mission loomed larger. In the common area, men were eating their final pre-mission meal, high-calorie, bland food consumed with mechanical efficiency. There was no boisterous talk, no bravado. Even Kowalski was quiet, his focus turned inward as he checked the straps on his pack for the 10th time. Alex sat by herself in a corner, not out of isolation, but because she seemed to exist in a different frequency than the rest of the world. She was already on the ridgeline in her mind, feeling the wind and calculating the drift. Reed watched her from across the room. He had seen hundreds of operators prepare for combat, but she was different. Most men built a wall of aggression or humor to shield themselves from the reality of what was coming. She didn't need a wall. She was the wall. There was a purity to her focus that was almost unsettling. He walked over to her carrying 2 plastic cups of water. Hydrate, he said, sets one down. She looked up, and for a second the mask of the operator slipped, revealing the tired girl underneath. Thanks, Calvin. You okay with the support element? Reed asked, referring to the soldier assigned to help her carry the heavy Barrett. 50 cal and the spotting equipment to the base of the ridge. I'm fine, she said. He's a good kid. Just told him to stay quiet and stay behind me. Reed nodded. He's lucky to be there. He gets a front row seat to history. She smiled then, a small, fleeting thing that didn't reach her eyes. History is for the people who survive to write it. We just have to survive the next 6 hours. Outside, the distant thump of rotor blades began to vibrate through the ground. The MH-60 Black Hawks were inbound. The sound was a trigger, a physical signal that the time for talking and planning was over. The men stood up in unison, the scraping of chair legs against the floor sounding like a volley of gunfire. They moved toward the flight line, their silhouettes stark against the floodlights of the base. Cross stood by the hangar doors, watching his team file past. He caught Alex's eye as she walked by, her long rifle case slung over her shoulder. Ghost, he said. She paused. See you on the other side. She nodded once and vanished into the darkness of the tarmac. The flight was a blur of noise and vibration. The interior of the Black Hawk was bathed in the eerie red glow of the combat lights. 12 men and 1 woman sat in 2 rows, knees touching, their faces obscured by night vision goggles and balaclavas. No one spoke. The pilots were flying low, hugging the contours of the jagged terrain to avoid radar detection. The aircraft bucked and swayed as it hit the mountain thermals, but the passengers remained motionless, locked into their own private prep. When the call came over the headsets, 1 minute, the crew chief slid the doors open. The freezing mountain air screamed into the cabin, bringing with it the scent of ice and ancient stone. The helicopters flared, their wheels touching the uneven ground for only a few seconds. The team poured out, disappearing into the shadows as the aircraft lifted away, the sound of their engines swallowed by the vastness of the valley. Alex and her support element, a young ranger named Miller, split off from the main group immediately. Their path took them upward, away from the valley floor and toward the jagged spine of the ridge. The climb was brutal. The air was thin and bit like a blade in their lungs. Miller was struggling with the weight, his breathing heavy and ragged in the quiet night, but Alex moved with a ghost-like efficiency. She seemed to glide over the rocks, her movements fluid and silent. They reached the base of the ridge line 20 minutes ahead of schedule. Alex signaled for Miller to drop the gear and set up a perimeter. She took the heavy rifle case from him and began the final ascent alone. This was the part of the mission she loved, the isolation, the absolute clarity of the task. She found the spot she had identified on the map, a natural depression in the rock that provided both cover and a clear line of sight to the compound below. She set up the rifle with practiced hands. The Barrett was a beast of a weapon, a semi-automatic sledgehammer designed to reach out and touch things over a mile away. She attached the suppressor, adjusted the bipod, and laid out her data book. The compound was visible through her spotting scope, a cluster of mud brick buildings and reinforced concrete walls huddled in the center of the valley. It looked peaceful from this distance, but she knew better. Ghost to lead, she whispered into her comms. Position established. Sight lines clear. Copy, Ghost. Cross's voice came back, crystal clear. 30 minutes to mark. She settled into the prone position, her body becoming part of the mountain. She began the process of reading the environment. She checked the Kestrel for wind speed and humidity. She noted the way the cold air was sinking into the valley, creating a downward draft. She visualized the flight path of the bullet, the way it would arch through the air, fighting the wind and gravity before finding its home. She was no longer Alexandra Adams. She was a biological computer, processing variables and waiting for the moment the math became reality. Down in the valley, the assault team was moving. Reed and Webb led the way, their movements synchronized and silent. They reached the 400-meter mark, the edge of the open ground, and went firm. They were invisible in their commo, mere shadows against the dark earth. They waited, their hearts beating in time with the countdown in their heads. At exactly 0150, the mark was called. The 11-minute window was open. The team rose as one and began the sprint across the open ground. It was the most vulnerable part of the mission. If a guard looked out from the tower now, the mission was over. But the overwatch was there. High above them, Alex watched the towers. She saw a guard shift his weight, his cigarette a tiny orange ember in the dark. She tracked him, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. He didn't look toward the valley floor. He was looking at the stars. The team reached the outer wall at 0201, 11 minutes exactly. The breach was a muffled thump, a sudden burst of activity that was over in seconds. They were inside. The radio chatter became a frantic, disciplined stream of reports. Room clear, hallway clear, moving to second floor. Alex stayed on the towers, her eyes scanning for any sign of a counterattack. She saw a door on the far side of the compound fly open. 2 men emerged, carrying AK-47s. They were running toward the stairs that led to the roof. Ghost, you have 2 movers, north side, Cross's voice crackled. I see them, she said. She didn't hesitate. She squeezed the trigger. The Barrett roared, the sound suppressed but still a significant crack in the mountain air. The first man was lifted off his feet and thrown backward. The second man stopped, confused, looking for the source of the fire. He didn't have time to find it. The second shot caught him in the chest, dropping him where he stood. Targets neutralized, she reported. The mission moved with a terrifying speed. The team found the high-value targets in a reinforced basement. There was a brief, violent exchange of fire, then the signal they had all been waiting for. Package secured, moving to extraction. But the noise had alerted the surrounding area. Lights began to flicker in the nearby village. Vehicles were starting up. Ghost, we have a vehicle moving toward the eastern gate. Webb's voice came through. It's a technical heavy machine gun in the back. They're going to pin us down at the extraction point. Alex shifted her position, her eyes searching for the vehicle. She saw it, a white pickup truck, its headlights cutting through the dust. It was moving fast, bouncing over the uneven ground. It was heading for a gap in the wall that would give it a clear line of fire to the landing zone. "I have the vehicle," she said. "Distance? 1,650 meters." She took a deep breath, slowing her heart rate. The truck was moving in a straight line now, heading for the gate. She had her 4 seconds. She adjusted the dial on her scope, compensating for the extreme distance and the moving target. She held the crosshairs ahead of the truck, leading it like a hunter leads a bird. 1, 2, 3, she fired. The recoil punched into her shoulder, but she didn't move. She watched through the scope as the heavy, .50 caliber round traveled the immense distance. It struck the rear quarter panel, punched through the thin metal, and entered the driver's compartment. The truck swerved violently, the driver slumped over the wheel. It hit a rock and flipped, the machine gun in the back torn from its mount. "Vehicle neutralized," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. The room at the base had called it a myth. Aucaffer had said it was impossible. But in the cold mountain air, the myth had become a matter of record. The helicopters were already screaming into the valley, their door guns raking the perimeter to keep the enemy back. The assault team scrambled aboard, the package in tow. "Ghost, get to the LZ," Cross ordered. "We're not leaving without you." Alex broke down the rifle with lightning speed, shoving the components into the case. She scrambled down the ridge, meeting Miller at the base. They ran toward the extraction point, the sound of the helicopters getting louder and louder. They reached the clearing just as the last Black Hawk touched down. The team pulled them inside, the doors sliding shut before the wheels had even left the ground. The ride back was different. The tension had broken, replaced by the adrenaline-fueled high of a successful mission. The men were shouting over the noise, clapping each other on the back. Webb looked across at Alex, his eyes wide behind his goggles. "That shot," he yelled. That was the one. She just nodded, leaning her head back against the fuselage. She was exhausted, the weight of the last 48 hours finally catching up to her. When they landed at FOB Rhino, the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. The team filed off the helicopters, moving toward the debriefing room. Cross was waiting for them. He looked at each man as they passed, then he stopped in front of Alex. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her, the ghost who had saved his team twice in one night. "Good work, Adams," he said. They spent the next 3 hours in debrief. Every detail was recorded, every shot accounted for. When it came time to write the official report, Cross sat in his office with the laptop open. He looked at the cursor blinking in the Overwatch field. He thought about the redacted pages of Aleppo. He thought about the 26 operations. Then he typed, "Overwatch provided by Alexandra Adams." He knew it would probably be changed by the time it reached the upper levels of command. He knew the bureaucrats would try to hide her again. But for now, in the record of FOB Rhino, her name was there. She wasn't a ghost anymore. Later that morning, as the base settled into its post-mission routine, Reed found Alex sitting on a crate near the flight line. She was watching the mechanics work on the helicopters. "Heading out?" he asked. "Yeah," she said. "Transport arrives in an hour." Reed sat down beside her. "You know, I've been doing this a long time. I thought I'd seen everything." She looked at him, a faint smile on her face. And I realized I don't know anything," he said with a laugh. She stood up, picking up her gear. "You're a good operator, Calvin. Those SEALs in Aleppo. They're alive because of people like you too, people who keep showing up." She walked toward the transport plane, her silhouette small against the vast expanse of the base. Reed watched her go, knowing he would probably never see her again. She would vanish back into the black programs, back into the shadows where the world's most important work was done by people nobody knew. But as the plane took off, disappearing into the bright morning sky, Reed felt a sense of peace. The gap between what he thought was true and what was actually true had been closed. He knew who had pulled the trigger. He knew her name. And in the world they lived in, sometimes that was the only victory that mattered. Back in the command center, Cross was closing the folder on the mission. He looked at the satellite image of the compound, now a blackened ruin in the mountains. He thought about the girl who had mapped the wind by the feel of the air on her skin. He hoped she got some sleep. He hoped she knew that, even if the world never found out, the men in that valley would never forget. The 19 hours of tension were over. The mountains were still there, silent and indifferent, but the world was a little bit different than it had been 2 days ago. A ghost had walked among them, and for a brief, shining moment, she had been seen. The silence that followed Aucaffer's nod was heavier than any spoken word could have been. In the insular, high-pressure world of Tier 1 operators, A nod from a man like Ockhafer was a currency of its own, rare and incredibly valuable. He was not a man given to flights of fancy or the honoring of myths. He dealt in the cold, hard metrics of survival and success. When he sat back in his chair, the rest of the room felt the shift in the atmosphere. It was a silent admission that the skepticism which had colored the previous 48 hours was beginning to erode, replaced by a grudging, watchful curiosity. The baseline of the mission had changed. They weren't just watching a woman take a spot on a ridge. They were watching a professional step into a role that few in that room could truly fathom. At 1600 hours, the sun began its slow descent behind the jagged teeth of the mountains, casting long, bruised shadows across the gravel of FOB Rhino. Kowalski appeared at the door of the equipment room, his presence announced by the soft scuff of his boots against the concrete. Alexandra Reyes was there, surrounded by the skeletal remains of her gear, performing a final check that was more ritual than requirement. Every strap, every buckle, and every ounce of weight was being accounted for with a clinical precision that bordered on the obsessive. Kowalski cleared his throat, his posture stiff. He mentioned needing to go over the weight distribution on the Overwatch kit, citing protocol. It was a thin excuse, the kind of institutional stutter that men used when they didn't know how to offer support to someone they had previously doubted. Reyes didn't look up from her work. Her hands continued to move, nimble and sure, checking the tension on a secondary pouch. She told him she knew what he was doing and that she appreciated the gesture, but she had packed this specific kit 100 times. There was no edge in her voice, just the flat, immutable truth of experience. Kowalski lingered in the doorway, his silhouette framed against the fading light. He started to speak, stopped, and then tried again, admitting he simply wanted things to go right. It was a moment of uncharacteristic vulnerability for a man whose life was defined by the rigid maintenance of machinery and order. Reyes finally looked up, her gaze meeting his with a steadiness that made him shift his weight. She didn't offer him a hollow reassurance or a boastful promise. She simply told him it would go right. It was a statement of professional fact, delivered with the quiet authority of someone who had survived the darkest valleys and the coldest ridgelines, someone who knew the exact boundaries of their own capability and had no need to prove it with words. She told him to check the helicopter maintenance log, giving him a task he could actually control. Kowalski almost smiled, a genuine personal acknowledgement that went beyond the hierarchy of rank. He called her ma'am, but the word carried a weight of respect that hadn't been there before. He left, and the silence of the equipment room returned, filled only by the metallic click of gear being finalized. By 2200 hours, the base had transitioned into its operational skin. The bright, harsh lights of the day were replaced by a dim, red-hued glow, and a heavy silence settled over the compound. The mission was 3 hours and 30 minutes out. This was the time of the quiet, where operators retreated into their own minds, running through their sequences, checking their gear one last time, or catching a few minutes of restless sleep. The common areas, once bustling with the loud energy of bored soldiers, were now ghost towns. Only the guard towers remained fully manned, eyes scanning the dark perimeter for any sign of movement. Reed found her near the eastern wall, in the same spot where Cross had stood with her the night before. The air was biting now, a precursor to the freezing temperatures of the high-altitude ridgeline. He asked her how she felt, a simple question that carried the weight of their shared history. She gave him the professional answer, she felt ready, but Reed pressed further, sensing the layers beneath the surface. He wasn't asking about her preparation, he was asking about her spirit. Reyes paused, her eyes fixed on the distant, invisible peaks. She described the feeling of everything else going quiet, until there was nothing left but the problem in front of her. It was a state of being that Reed knew well, a singular focus that stripped away the noise of fear and doubt. They stood together in the cold, the thick cloud cover above them acting as a shroud that blocked out every star. The world felt small, confined to the few yards of earth between them and the wire. Reyes spoke again, her voice low and steady. She told Reed that if something went wrong, the mission priority had to remain the hostages. She wasn't being pessimistic, she was being a realist. She demanded that the assault team not abort for her, framed not as a request, but as a standing order that she needed him to ensure Cross understood. Reed's jaw tightened, the conflict clear on his face. He didn't want to imagine a scenario where they left her on that mountain, but Reyes looked at him with a directness that brooked no argument. She asked him to promise her. It was the only time her voice carried a hint of personal weight. Reed held her gaze for a long moment, the wind whipping between them before finally nodding his assent. They shared another minute of silence, a final communion before the storm, and then Reed turned back toward the lights of the command center. Reyes stayed at the wall alone, a small figure against the backdrop of the enormous, dark, and absolutely still mountains. At 0115 hours, the silence was shattered by the rhythmic, chest-thumping roar of helicopter rotors. Reyes climbed into the belly of the beast, the noise so total it seemed to vibrate through her very bones. In the cramped, dimly lit cabin, thought became something you did around the sound rather than through it. She sat with her rifle case across her knees and her pack tucked between her feet, her eyes closed. She wasn't resting, she was rehearsing. In the private theater of her mind, she was already on the ridgeline. She saw the position, the sight lines, the way the wind would swirl through the valley. She prioritized her targets and ran through every contingency, every what-if that could mean the difference between life and death. Webb sat across from her, his face obscured by the shadows and his gear. He caught her eye once and gave her a single, sharp nod. It wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was the acknowledgement of one operator to another, a silent pact of trust. "Let's go." She nodded back, a mirror of his resolve. The helicopter banked, the floor tilting beneath them as they began their final approach into the heart of the darkness. The touchdown at 0133 hours was brief and efficient. The helicopter settled into a shallow valley 3 kilometers from the ridgeline, its wheels barely touching the earth before Reyes was out the door and moving. She was accompanied by Aaron Cole, a 24-year-old ranger specialist who had been handpicked for his fitness and his uncanny ability to move through broken terrain in total silence. He was her shadow, carrying half her equipment and asking no questions. It was exactly what she had requested. They moved uphill through the dark at a punishing pace. For most, the climb would have been a grueling ordeal, but for them, it was a measured exertion. Cole had worked with the best, but as he followed Reyes, he realized he had never seen anyone move quite like this. She didn't just walk, she navigated the terrain as if she had already memorized it in a previous life. Every footfall was certain, every movement economical. She was a part of the darkness, not an intruder in it. By 0201 hours, they reached the base of the final ascent. This was the parting of ways. Reyes spoke quietly, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. She took the remaining equipment from Cole, extra ammunition, a spare scope, the relay unit, and stowed it with the practiced efficiency of a machine. Cole wished her luck, his voice hushed. She gave him his final instructions. Wait at the extraction point and do not move, regardless of what he heard. He understood. Reyes turned and began the final climb alone, disappearing into the vertical shadows of the ridge. At 0223 hours, exactly when she had predicted, her voice crackled over the encrypted command channel. It was clear and steady, a beacon of professional calm that cut through the tension in the assault staging area 400 meters below. Ghost actual position established. Sightlines confirmed. Overwatch is live. In the staging area, Webb felt a physical release of tension. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. Cross, back at the command center, acknowledged the report with a simple copy ghost, and then gave the order for the assault team to stand by. The clock was ticking, and the pieces were finally in place. As the assault team began their approach at 0224 hours, Reyes settled behind her rifle in the frozen dark. In that moment, she ceased to be a person with a history or a name. She became an extension of the weapon, a creature of pure, uncompromising geometry. She was present in a way that few ever experience, her world shrinking down to the relationship between distance, wind, and the weight of the lives she was protecting. She breathed, feeling the rhythm of the mountain, reading the way the air moved across the valley floor. The first 6 minutes were a study in controlled efficiency. The assault team moved like shadows across the open ground, and Reyes tracked them through her scope while simultaneously scanning the guard positions on the compound wall. She monitored the secondary tower and the rooftop position that had been identified as the primary threat. Then, 6 minutes and 40 seconds into the approach, the rhythm broke. A rooftop guard moved, an unscheduled shift that put him in a position to see the entire approach path. Reyes reported the movement instantly. Her voice was devoid of urgency, providing pure, actionable information. Cross ordered the team to hold. 14 operators went flat in the dirt, 400 meters of exposure stretching out around them. For 22 agonizing seconds, the command net was silent. Reyes watched the guard through her crosshairs, her finger light on the trigger. Then the guard turned and walked back toward the center of the roof. Reyes gave the signal and the team surged forward again. They reached the outer wall at 0238 hours. The breach team set their charges on the gate, a precise, controlled explosion designed to be a whisper rather than a scream. The gate gave way and the first operators crossed the threshold. That was when the night shattered. An undocumented secondary alert system, hidden from all previous intelligence, triggered the moment the gate was breached. The compound erupted into a chaotic symphony of lights, shouting, and the frantic sound of men running. The gunfire started from the northern tower. A burst of automatic fire kicked up the dirt near Webb, forcing him to dive for cover behind a low stone wall. 2 more operators were pinned down, returning fire at muzzle flashes obscured by the darkness. Webb called out the contact, his voice a testament to years of training. Reyes had already reacted. She had calculated the wind, and the elevation changed the moment the explosion happened. 14 seconds after the initial contact, she had the target in her sights. She fired. The north tower went silent instantly, but the compound was a hornet's nest. 3 more positions opened up, 2 on the eastern roof and 1 in the inner courtyard. The assault team was caught in a crossfire, the mission teetering on the edge of a disaster. The rules of engagement were strict. They had hostages to consider. Ockhafer's voice came over the net, strained by the physical exertion of movement. He needed the eastern roof cleared before he could advance. Reyes was already working the problem. What she did next was a feat of skill that few snipers in the world could replicate. She was tracking 2 targets in sequence, calculating the variables for both simultaneously. She had to decide which one was the greater threat and then shift her position and her aim in the heartbeats between shots. The first shot took out the first position on the eastern roof. The second target tried to dive for cover, but Reyes was faster. She waited for a 3-second lull in the wind, a tiny window of opportunity, and then she took the shot. The second position went dark. Ockhafer and his team surged forward, but a ground-level position in the courtyard remained active, shielded from Reyes's current angle by an interior wall. She communicated this immediately, allowing the team to adjust their tactics. The next 90 seconds were a blur of organized violence. Each operator worked their part of the puzzle, trusting their teammates to do the same. Reyes cleared the perimeter, neutralizing a guard who emerged from a side building, and then, most critically, a man who appeared on the western roof with an RPG launcher. Back at FOB Rhino, Reed closed his eyes. An RPG in that confined courtyard would have been a massacre. Reyes saw the launcher rise. She took the shot from 1,200 meters, adjusting for a 38-kilometer-per-hour wind gust. 1 round. The man with the RPG went down before he could pull the trigger. The radio operator next to Reed was staring at the panel in disbelief, whispering a question about who she was. Reed looked at him and told him the truth. She was the person who had just saved his friends, and her name was something he would never need to know. Inside the main structure, the breach team reached the basement. They found the 3 American aid workers, weak, terrified, but alive. Webb's voice came over the net at 0259 hours, confirming the rescue. The command center exhaled, a collective release of tension that filled the room. But the mission wasn't over. Cross ordered the team to move to the extraction point and told Reyes to maintain her overwatch. Then the final complication arose. A dark SUV, hidden in a garage that had escaped satellite detection, roared out of a secondary gate, heading toward the Pakistan border at high speed. Inside was the man who ran the entire network, the primary target of the operation. If he reached the border, he would be gone. Cross looked at the tactical display, calculating the distance and the speed. He made the call. He gave Reyes the authorization to fire. What followed became a legend in the special operations community. The vehicle was moving at 60 kilometers per hour on a narrow dirt road. Reyes needed a 4-second window of straight travel. She tracked the SUV from 1,600 meters away, her mind a calculator of physics and probability. She found her window, breathed, and pulled the trigger. The bullet traveled through the cold air for 2 seconds, a tiny messenger of finality. The SUV veered off the road and stopped. The surveillance drone confirmed the kill, no movement, target down. The command center at FOB Rhino was deathly silent. Cross stood at the table, his face unreadable, his mind reeling from what he had just witnessed. He pressed his radio and told her it was outstanding work. It was a simple statement, but in that moment it was the only thing that felt true. Reed said nothing, his eyes fixed on the display as the assault team and the hostages moved toward the extraction point. 12 operators, 3 aid workers, all alive because of a woman alone on a ridge. The first helicopter returned to the base at 0412 hours. Webb helped the hostages toward the medical bay, his face lined with the exhaustion of the night. He looked up at the sky, waiting for the second bird. Reed was already on the landing pad, standing with the rest of the command element. There was a silent agreement among the men who had stood at the firing range 2 days before. A debt had been incurred, and it was time to start paying it. As the second helicopter touched down, the door slid open and Reyes climbed out. She was a different person than the one who had left hours before. She was covered in the grime of the mountain, her movements heavy with the fatigue of the long, cold vigil. She carried her gear with a stoic endurance, looking like a soldier who had done her job and was ready for the next one. She stopped when she saw the crowd. Standing on the landing pad were 37 operators, SEALs, Rangers, Delta. The very men who had mocked her, who had made bets on her failure, were now standing in a perfect, silent formation. Cross stepped forward, the legendary commander whose respect was the highest honor on the base. In the pre-dawn light with the rotors still spinning, he raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute. It wasn't about rank, it was about the recognition of a peer, a warrior who had proven herself in the crucible of combat. One by one, every man on that landing pad followed his lead. 37 men saluting the woman they had dismissed. It was a moment of profound, imperfect truth. Reed was the last to lower his hand, his gaze lingering on her for an extra second, absorbing the reality of what he had seen. Kowalski stood at the edge, his jaw no longer tight, and young Tommy Garrett blinked back tears he couldn't explain. Reyes looked at them, her expression unreadable. She returned the salute and then began walking toward the debrief room, her boots crunching on the gravel. As she passed Reed, he heard her mutter a single sentence, more to herself than anyone else. Same as it ever was. There was no bitterness in her voice, just the quiet peace of someone who knew their worth and required no validation from the world. The debrief room was a theater of shadows and stale coffee. The air was thick with the scent of spent adrenaline. Reyes sat among the men she had saved, her rifle leaning against the wall behind her. She spoke for 11 minutes, providing a clinical, detailed account of every shot, every wind adjustment, and every movement. She was the most composed person in the room. When she finished, Moss, the ranger sergeant, broke the silence. He mentioned the RPG on the west roof, noting that she had called it before he even saw the launcher. Reyes looked at him, her voice as flat as the horizon. She told him she had seen the position change 20 seconds before the launcher was even raised. The room went silent again, the full weight of her skill finally, undeniably, sinking in. The room remained in a state of suspended animation after her last words. It wasn't just the fact of the 20 seconds. It was the realization of the cognitive layer she operated on. While they were fighting for inches in the dirt, she was reading the future in the subtle shifts of shadows, and the way a man adjusted his weight on a rooftop hundreds of meters away. It was a level of situational awareness that bordered on the supernatural, yet it was grounded in the most rigorous, punishing discipline any of them had ever encountered. Cross looked around the table. He saw the faces of his men, hardened, cynical professionals who had seen it all, and he saw the way they were looking at Reyes now. The air of condescension that had permeated the base for the last 48 hours hadn't just evaporated. It had been incinerated. He tapped his pen against the tabletop, a rhythmic sound that seemed to sync with the ticking of the wall clock. The official record would show a successful rescue and a high-value target neutralized. It would list the rounds fired and the timestamps of each engagement, but it would never capture the shift in the soul of the unit. Webb, his gear still dusted with the gray grit of the compound's walls, leaned forward. He didn't look like the man who had been cracking jokes 2 days ago. He looked like someone who had just come back from the edge and realized who had been holding the rope. He asked her about the 1,600-meter shot on the SUV, specifically the lead she had taken on a moving target in that crosswind. He wasn't questioning her. He was seeking knowledge, like a student asking a master for the secret of a stroke. Reyes didn't treat the question as a trophy. She didn't embellish. She described the lead in terms of mills, and the estimated velocity of the vehicle based on the RPM she could hear through her high-sensitivity audio relay. She talked about the flutter of the wind in the narrow pass and how she had timed the shot to the suspension's compression as the vehicle hit a rut in the road. It was a masterclass in ballistics and environmental analysis, delivered with the same emotion one might use to read a grocery list. The Ranger Sergeant Moss rubbed his face with his hands, the stubble rasping against his palms. He admitted that they hadn't given her a fair shake. It was as close to an apology as a man in his position ever got in a room full of peers. Reyes didn't acknowledge it with a "thank you" or an "it's okay." She simply told him that the mountain doesn't care about fairness. It only cares about who is still standing when the sun comes up. It was a harsh truth, but it was the one they lived by. Reed watched her throughout the exchange. He saw the way she held her water bottle, the steady pulse in her neck, the way her eyes never darted or showed a flicker of the trauma they had all just participated in. He realized then that her same as it ever was comment wasn't about the mission or the men. It was about the cycle of excellence being met with doubt, and the quiet satisfaction of the work itself being the only reward that actually mattered. She had lived this story before, in different valleys and on different ridgelines, and she would likely live it again. As the debrief wound down, Cross stood up, signaling the end of the formal proceedings. He told them to get some rack time, noting that the transport out of Rhino wouldn't be ready until the following evening. The men began to filter out, their movements sluggish as the exhaustion finally caught up with them. Some offered Reyes a nod as they passed, others just looked at the floor, still processing the day. Webb stayed behind for a moment, standing by the door. He looked at Reyes and told her that if she ever needed a spotter who knew when to shut up, his door was always open. It was a genuine offer, a gesture of integration. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible tilt of her head. He took it as a win and walked out into the cool morning air. Finally, it was just Cross, Reed, and Reyes in the room. The silence was different now, not the silence of tension, but the silence of an aftermath. Cross walked over to the window, looking out at the landing pad where the helicopters were being refueled. He spoke without turning around, telling her that he was sending a personal commendation to her command. He added that he'd be including his own assessment of the mission's success being directly tied to her performance. Reyes stood up, slinging her rifle case over her shoulder with a fluid motion. She thanked him, her voice polite but distant. She wasn't looking for a medal or a write-up. She was already thinking about the maintenance her rifle would need, the cleaning of the bore, the checking of the optics after the temperature fluctuations of the night. She was already moving back into her process. Reed walked her toward the door. He asked her if she was actually going to sleep or if she was going to spend the next 4 hours cleaning that weapon. She gave him a look that was almost a smile, the first real crack in the professional mask he'd seen since she arrived. She told him that the weapon had done its part, so it deserved to be taken care of first. He chuckled, a tired, dry sound, and told her he'd see her at the mess hall in a few hours. He watched her walk down the hallway, her silhouette framed by the harsh, fluorescent lights. She moved with a purpose that didn't diminish even in her exhaustion. She was a singular force, a person who had found the one thing she was meant to do and did it with a terrifying, beautiful perfection. Reed stepped outside, the morning air shocking his lungs. The sky was a pale, bruised purple now, and the first hints of gold were touching the highest peaks of the mountains. He thought about the 37 men saluting on the tarmac. He thought about the man with the RPG who never saw the bullet coming. And he thought about the aid workers who were probably sleeping for the first time in weeks without the shadow of a blade over their necks. He realized then that the base felt different. The air was clearer. The noise of the generators and the distant hum of activity felt less like a chaotic intrusion and more like the heartbeat of a machine that had been tuned to a higher frequency. One woman had changed the gravity of the place. She hadn't done it with speeches or by demanding respect. She had done it by being better than everyone else and by being the only one in the room who didn't feel the need to say so. As he walked toward his quarters, Reed looked back at the eastern wall. The mountains were still there, enormous and indifferent, but they didn't seem quite so threatening anymore. They were just terrain. And he knew that as long as there were people like Alexandra Reyes willing to climb them in the dark, the world would keep turning, one calculated breath at a time. The mess hall later that afternoon was a different world than it had been 48 hours prior. When Reyes walked in, the room didn't go silent. That would have been too dramatic, too scripted. Instead, the noise just shifted. The boisterous, peacocking energy of the operators had been replaced by a quiet, professional hum. Men who had previously looked through her now made eye contact. They moved aside to let her pass, not with a flourish, but with the simple, unstated courtesy they showed each other. Kowalski was at a corner table, nursing a cup of coffee that looked like it had been sitting there since the mission launched. He looked up as she approached, his eyes tired but bright. He asked if the gear held up. She sat down across from him, her posture still straight despite the lack of sleep. She told him the weight distribution was perfect and thanked him for the final check. It was a small thing, but Kowalski's chest seemed to expand just a fraction. He had been a part of the success, and he knew it. Tommy Garrett, the young radio operator, was sitting 2 tables away, whispering to a friend. Every few seconds, he would glance over at Ray's, his expression one of pure, unadulterated awe. He was the one who would tell the story to the newcomers. He would be the one to keep the legend alive, adding layers of myth to the reality until it became a ghost story told around campfires in training camps for years to reach. Webb and Moss were at the center table, surrounded by their teams. They were reliving the breach, but the tone had changed. They weren't bragging about their own prowess. They were talking about the precision of the Overwatch. They were discussing the shots as if they were analyzing a high-speed physics experiment. When Ray's caught Webb's eye, he raised his juice carton in a silent toast. She gave him a short nod and went back to her meal. The transport arrived at 1900 hours the following day. The C-130 sat on the runway, its engines idling with a deep, throaty rumble that shook the ground. The operators were boarding in a line, their gear bags slung over their shoulders. Ray's was among them, her rifle case once again her constant companion. Cross stood by the ramp, shaking hands with the men as they boarded. When Ray's reached him, he didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he stepped back and gave her a sharp, formal salute. It was the final acknowledgement, the period at the end of the sentence. She returned it with the same crispness and disappeared into the cavernous, dimly lit hold of the plane. Reed was the last one on. He stopped next to Cross for a moment, the wind from the engines whipping his hair. He asked the commander if he thought they'd see her again. Cross looked at the plane, his eyes focused on the dark interior where the ghost had vanished. He said he hoped so, but he doubted it. People like her don't stay in one place long enough to be seen twice. They're like lightning. You see the flash, you hear the thunder, and then they're gone, leaving you standing in the dark, wondering if you really saw what you thought you saw. The ramp hissed shut, sealing the team inside. The C-130 began its taxi, the roar of the engines reaching a crescendo as it surged down the runway and lifted off into the darkening sky. Within minutes, the lights of the plane were just another star in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Afghan night. Back at FOB Rhino, the routine began to reset. The next mission was already being planned, the next set of coordinates being analyzed. But the memory of the ridge remained. It lived in the way the guards scanned the perimeter, in the way the maintenance crews checked the gear, and in the way the men talked about the quiet before a storm. Months later, in a bar outside of Fort Bragg, a young ranger would tell a story about a mission where everything went wrong, but everyone came home. He would talk about a woman on a ridge who could see the future and a shot that traveled 1,600 meters to find the heart of a target in the dead of night. His listeners would shake their heads and call it a tall tale, the kind of thing soldiers invent to make the world seem less random. But at a table in the corner, a man with graying hair and a scar on his jaw would listen to the story and say nothing. He would remember the way the rotors felt in his chest, the sound of a single shot echoing through a valley, and the sight of 37 men saluting a woman in the pre-dawn cold. He would know it wasn't a myth. He would know that somewhere out there, in some other dark valley on some other cold ridgeline, the ghost was still watching, still breathing and still waiting for the wind to pass. And as the years went by, the details of the mission would fade, but the feeling would remain. The realization that there are people in this world who operate on a different plane of existence, who carry the weight of the world on their shoulders without ever asking for help or recognition. They are the silent guardians, the keepers of the geometry of distance and wind. And while their names might never be written in history books, their presence is felt in every life they save and every bullet that finds its mark in the dark. Same as it ever was. The words would echo in Reed's mind whenever he found himself in a tight spot, a reminder of the standard that had been set on that ridge. It wasn't about the glory, it was about the work. It was about being perfectly, completely present in a single moment, in a single task, and doing it so well that the world had no choice but to acknowledge the truth of it. And in that acknowledgement, the world became a slightly better, slightly safer place, one shot at a time. The air in the debriefing room was thick, not just with the scent of stale coffee and the metallic tang of cooling electronics, but with a heavy, unarticulated tension. The mission was over. The adrenaline had long since ebbed away, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that made every movement feel like it was happening underwater. Moss sat at the edge of his chair, his hands clasped tightly between his knees, staring at the woman across from him with an intensity that bordered on disbelief. He was a man who had survived 6 combat deployments, a veteran of the kind of skirmishes that didn't make the news but left permanent marks on the soul. He knew what he had seen, or rather, what he thought he had seen. But as he listened to her describe the movement on that distant rooftop, the way the target had shifted his weight, the specific angle of his body as he tracked the assault team below, Moss felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She hadn't just seen a man with a gun. She had seen a predator selecting his kill zone. Moss spoke up, his voice raspy from the night's shouting and the dust of the valley. He told her that he had watched that same man through his own optics, and he would never have called that movement. To him, the man looked like he was searching for an exit, a way to escape the closing circle of the Rangers. But she had seen the truth. She saw the way his elbow tucked, the way his center of gravity lowered, and the way his eyes weren't scanning the perimeter for a hole, but were instead fixed on a specific firing lane that would have decimated the team's flank. "You would have called it," she told him calmly, her voice as steady as a heartbeat in a resting body. Not in time, Moss countered. The team was already in the funnel. If that shot hadn't broken when it did, we would be counting bodies right now instead of debriefing. She didn't respond to that. There was no point. The shot had been taken, the bullet had found its mark at 1,400 meters in the pitch black of an Afghan night, and the reality they were living in was the only one that mattered. She had no interest in the what-ifs or the hypothetical graveyards of missions gone wrong. She was a creature of the absolute. Productivity was her only metric, and discussing a past that didn't happen was a waste of breath. But for Moss, this wasn't about productivity. It was about the slow, painful process of absorbing a truth that had personal stakes. He wasn't looking at a ghost or a machine. He was looking at the reason he was still breathing, sitting in a plastic chair in a room that smelled of recycled air. He looked down at the table for a long, silent moment, then looked back up at her, his eyes clear and focused. He said thank you, and he said it with a quiet gravity that made the room go still. He wanted it on the record, spoken out loud in front of the others. The words seemed to ripple outward from the center of the table. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, not the kind of thing you see in a film, but something far more real. It was like a stone dropped into the dark, still water of a mountain lake, sending out rings that moved silently toward the shore. Webb, leaning back against the wall, cleared his throat and added his own weight to the room. He spoke about the North Tower, about a burst of fire that had missed him by a mere 4 feet, or maybe less. He knew that the only reason that Gunner hadn't adjusted his aim was because a single round had ended the threat before the second burst could leave the barrel. Then Aucaffer spoke, his voice filled with a different kind of intensity. He was a man who understood ballistics, who understood the mathematics of death at a distance. He asked about the east roof position, about the partial cover shot. He needed to understand how it was physically possible to hit a 4-inch target at that distance, under those conditions, while the target was moving. She looked at Aucaffer, her expression unreadable. She wasn't being secretive or humble. She was simply calculating how to explain a complex physical feat in a way that was actually useful to him. She told him about the wind. She hadn't just checked a meter. She had been tracking the wind cycle for 40 minutes before the shot. She knew the pattern. It was a 3-second cycle, a rhythmic pulse of air that moved through the valley like a breath. She knew exactly when the gust would peak and, more importantly, exactly when the trough would occur. She waited for that lull, a window of approximately 4 seconds where the wind resistance dropped just enough to make the shot viable. The 4 inches of the target wasn't the challenge for her. The challenge was the timing. If she had been even half a second late on the trigger brake, the returning gust would have caught the bullet at 800 meters, pushing it wide enough to miss by a foot. Aucaffer stared at her, his mind running the numbers. Half a second. In the world of long-range precision, half a second is an eternity and a heartbeat all at once. The room absorbed this information in silence, the weight of her skill pressing down on them. Then Cross looked up from his notebook. Benjamin Cross was not a man given to hyperbole. He was the kind of commander who viewed the world through the lens of objectives, logistics, and casualty reports. He asked her about the vehicle shot. He said it neutrally, without any inflection that might betray his own amazement, but everyone at the table knew what those 3 words represented. A moving vehicle, high speed, extreme distance, and a single window of opportunity. She walked them through it with the same clinical, technical precision she had used for everything else. The vehicle speed was estimated at 62 kilometers per hour. The road geometry provided a 400-meter stretch of straight travel before it curved behind a rock face. The distance at the moment of the shot was 1,640 meters. The wind was a momentary lull, a gap of less than 3 seconds caught between the tail of one gust and the leading edge of the next. She had calculated the firing solution in real time, timing the shot break at the exact halfway point of the straight section. This allowed the round and the vehicle to arrive at the same geographical coordinate at the exact same moment. When she finished, a small voice came from the corner of the room. It was the meteorologist, a man who spent his days staring at screens and sensors. He said, almost in a whisper, that he had clocked that specific lull on his instruments. It had lasted exactly 8 seconds. She turned her gaze toward him and nodded. She told him she knew. She had felt the air change, felt the lull extend to 8 seconds in the final 40 seconds of the vehicle's approach. She had adjusted her lead accordingly. The meteorologist looked at Cross, his expression one of pure, unadulterated shock. He didn't need to say anything. The data confirmed the impossible. Cross closed his notebook with a soft thud. He placed both hands flat on the table, a gesture of finality and command. He did something then that no one in the room had seen him do in recent memory. He paused. It wasn't a pause to organize his thoughts or to check his notes. It was a human pause, the kind a person makes when they are about to say something that carries a personal weight, something that transcends the professional boundaries of rank and file. He looked around the table, meeting the eyes of every man there. He told them that what he was about to say was a matter of official record. He was putting it in the mission report, and he was prepared to fight any attempt to redact it, no matter how high up the chain he had to go. He used her full rank and name for the first time, Chief Warrant Officer Alexandra Reyes. He stated for the record that she had executed 11 separate precision engagements that night under conditions that exceeded every established operational parameter for long-range fire. She had neutralized every threat to the assault team without a single error. She had enabled the recovery of 3 American citizens who would not have survived another 48 hours in that compound. And she had made a 1,600-meter engagement under conditions that he was formally describing as extraordinary, because he simply did not have a more accurate word in his vocabulary. The silence that followed was different. It had a specific gravity to it. It was the weight of a truth that had been hidden in the shadows for over a decade, finally being dragged into the light. Cross continued, his voice steady but filled with a simmering undercurrent of frustration. He told the room that she had done this before, 26 times over the course of 11 years, 26 operations that were successful because of her, and 26 times her contribution had been classified to a level that prevented the very people she saved from even knowing her name. He called it an institutional failure. He told them he was saying it now in this room, and he would say it in every briefing and every report that followed. Reed sat at the table, his jaw tight as he did the math. 11 years. 11 years of missions where the difference between life and death was a woman they weren't allowed to thank. He thought about the official records that attributed success to unit cohesion or superior planning, never once mentioning the ghost on the ridgeline who had cleared the path. He asked Cross what would happen to the report. Cross told him it would go up. Where it went from there was out of his hands, but it would go up with his name on it, and anyone who wanted to strike her name from the record would have to do so over his formal, written objection. Webb nodded, then looked at Reyes. Her expression was a complex map of emotions that didn't quite settle into any one category. It wasn't relief, and it wasn't exactly gratitude or vindication. It was the look of a person who had spent a lifetime in the dark and was suddenly, unexpectedly, being seen. As the debrief ended and the men began to file out of the room, the adrenaline finally vanished completely. The exhaustion that had been held at bay by the structure of the meeting came crashing back. Men who had been sitting straight for 90 minutes suddenly looked their age, their shoulders slouching under the weight of the night's events. Reed caught her in the hallway as the light of dawn began to gray the edges of the base. He asked her if she was okay, and she took the question with the same seriousness she gave a ballistic calculation. She told him she was tired. Reed gave her a weary smile and told her that was allowed. In fact, after a night like that, it was required. There was a brief moment then, a shift in her professional composure, a flicker of warmth that was quiet and real. She called him by his first name, Calvin, and told him to go get some rest. He nodded and told her the same. She walked to the small, cramped quarters assigned to her and sat on the edge of the bunk. She put her face in her hands, not to cry, but to simply feel the weight of the night settle. 11 shots. 11 moments where the entire world had narrowed down to a single point of contact between her and a reality that demanded perfection. She had done it alone, just as she always had. She lay back on the bunk, still wearing her jacket, and the darkness took her in less than 3 minutes. By mid-morning, a quiet energy began to circulate through FOB Rhino. It wasn't something dictated by the command structure. It was something organic, something that started with Webb in the common area. He was sitting with a cup of coffee when Specialist Cole, the young ranger who had carried Ray's gear to the base of the ridge, walked in. Cole looked like he hadn't slept a wink. He had the haunted, restless look of a young man who had been wrestling with a thought that had grown too big for him to keep inside. He asked Webb how a person could do what she did. He had sat at the extraction point for hours, listening to her calls over the radio, hearing the clinical way she reported each neutralized threat. He realized then that she had been entirely alone up there. No spotter, no backup, just a woman on a mountain with a rifle. Webb told him that he didn't know the answer, but he suspected it came from a long time spent doing the hardest things imaginable without anyone ever acknowledging it. That kind of life either builds something unbreakable in a person, or it shatters them completely. Cole nodded slowly, looking at his hands. He told Webb that she had thanked him by name when they reached the ridgeline. She knew his first name was Aaron. Webb told him that she knew everyone's name. She had read every file before she even set foot on the base. She took people seriously, Webb explained, even when those people hadn't yet learned to take her seriously. Cole sat with that for a moment, then told Webb he wanted to do something for her before she left. Webb told him to talk to Reed. Reed was already ahead of them. He had been awake since 6, fueled by a thought that had crystallized the moment he woke up. The salute they had given her on the landing pad had been a powerful, reactive gesture, a response to the immediate awe of her performance. But it wasn't enough. It was a reaction, not a choice. He wanted something deliberate. He wanted something that said, "We see you, we know what we owe you, and we are choosing to honor that debt." He spent the morning moving quietly through the base, talking to the men one by one. He didn't have to convince anyone. Moss, Acaffer, Kowalski, they all said yes before he could even finish the sentence. Then there was Tommy Garrett. He was only 22, and he was the one who had laughed in the briefing room, the one who had called her sweetheart in the privacy of his own mind. He hadn't slept either. He told Reed he wanted to do something more than just show up. He wanted her to know that he understood how wrong he had been. He didn't want to make it about his own guilt, but he needed her to know that he saw the truth now. Reed looked at the young soldier and told him to write it down, to put the truth on paper. Garrett seemed surprised by the suggestion, but Reed told him that she would know the difference between a hollow apology and the truth. At 2 in the afternoon, the bureaucratic machinery of the military began to push back. Cross took a call on a secure line that lasted 17 minutes, and when he hung up, he sat in silence for a long time. He called Reed into his office and told him there was a problem. The report had reached the deputy director level, and the response was an immediate push to reclassify the entire operation. They wanted her name removed, the details of her shots buried under a mountain of security clearances. The official excuse was operational security and exposure risk, but Cross and Reed both knew the real reason. The system wasn't designed to acknowledge a ghost. Reed felt a surge of cold anger. He looked out the window at the men on the base, the rangers, the specialists, the people whose lives had been saved by the very woman the brass wanted to erase. He asked Cross what he was going to do. Cross told him he was going to fight. He had a formal objection ready, and he was attaching a signed statement from every operator who had been on the ground that night. He was also formally recommending her for multiple decorations, awards that were far above his pay grade to give, but he was putting his own career on the line to make the recommendation. He told Reed that he wanted Reyes to know that this wasn't just a commander doing paperwork. He wanted her to know that the men she saved were standing right behind him. Reed didn't need an hour. Within 55 minutes, he had a signature from every person on FOB Rhino with knowledge of the mission. No one had to be pressured. Moss signed it without even reading the text, stating simply that she was the best they had ever seen. Aucaffer read every word, corrected a single technical sentence for accuracy, and signed it with a grim nod. Garrett signed it with a shaking hand, pressing the pen so hard into the paper that it left an indentation on the page. It was a testament of 31 men, a physical manifestation of a debt that could never truly be repaid. Cross found Reyes in the equipment room later that afternoon. She was cleaning her rifle, a meticulous process she performed with a steady, practiced hand. He sat across from her and told her everything: the report, the pushback from HQ, the formal objection, and the signed statements. He laid the folder on the bench in front of her. She didn't pick it up at first. She just stared at the stack of papers, her eyes tracking the list of names visible on the top sheet. A small, almost imperceptible change came over her. The set of her jaw tightened, and a slight tension appeared around her eyes. She told him they would redact it anyway. She had 11 years of experience telling her that her name would always be a secret. Cross didn't deny it. He told her they might redact the official document, but they couldn't redact the 31 men who had signed those papers. He told her it wasn't justice, but it was a start. It was real, and it was theirs. They hadn't signed because of an order. They had signed because they wanted to. She reached out then and placed her hand on the folder. She didn't open it. She just felt the weight of it. She spoke about the 11 years and the 26 operations, her voice low and steady. Cross told her he knew. He told her she wasn't leaving yet, that he had engineered a 48-hour delay in the transport schedule. It wasn't standard protocol, but as the commander, he had discretion. She looked at him, and for a moment, the gap between what she wanted to say and what she knew how to say seemed too wide to bridge. She finally told him that it mattered. She wanted him to know that even if nothing changed in the official record, the gesture itself carried a weight she hadn't expected. Cross held her gaze and told her that things like this always change something, even if the change isn't visible on a piece of paper. He left her then, and she went back to her rifle. The work of her hands gave her something to focus on while her mind processed the reality of those 31 signatures. Later that evening, Tommy Garrett knocked on her door. He looked like he had been pacing the hallway for hours. He held out a folded piece of paper and told her he had written down what he needed to say. He told her he had said it better on paper than he could out loud. She took the note and told him she didn't need an apology, but Garrett corrected her. He said he didn't write it for her, he wrote it for himself. He was 22, and he needed to acknowledge his mistake now so he could be a better man for the rest of his life. She looked at the young soldier, seeing the raw, earnest courage it took for him to stand there. She thanked him using his first name, and his face lit up with a quiet internal recognition. After he left, she read the note, folded it carefully, and placed it in the personal pocket of her bag, the place where she kept the few things that weren't related to the job. Outside, the mountains of Afghanistan remained as they had always been, vast, cold, and indifferent. But the world had changed in small, profound ways. 11 positions were clear. 3 people were alive, and for the first time in over a decade, a woman who had spent her life as a ghost had been seen by the people around her. The 48 hours that followed weren't a delay. They were a transition. The men of FOB Rhino moved through their days with a different sense of purpose. There was a shared understanding, a collective memory of a night that had redefined their understanding of what was possible. On Thursday morning, Reed knocked on her door again and told her that everyone was waiting in the mess hall. She grabbed her jacket and followed him. She didn't ask why. She had learned to trust the men of this base. The mess hall was the same room it had always been, with its plastic tables and fluorescent lights, but the atmosphere was transformed. Every man who had been part of the operation was there, along with many others who had simply heard the story. As she entered, the low hum of conversation died down. There were no cheers, no loud proclamations. There was only a profound, respectful silence. They were all standing. Cross stood at the head of the room, not as a commander giving an order, but as a witness to a truth that had finally been spoken. She stood at the entrance for a moment, her eyes scanning the room. She saw Moss, Webb, Ockhafer, and young Garrett. She saw the meteorologist and the rangers who had provided the perimeter. She saw 31 men and many more who were looking at her not as a tactical asset or a classified resource, but as a person. The silence held for a long time, a shared acknowledgement of the weight she had carried alone for 11 years. And in that room, in the heart of a war-torn mountain range, the isolation she had lived in for so long began to dissolve, replaced by the simple, powerful reality of being known. The breakfast that followed was different from any other she had experienced. There was talk not just of ballistics and wind cycles, but of home, of life outside the uniform, and of the things that kept them going in the dark. She found herself speaking, not as an instructor or a phantom, but as a peer. She shared stories of her own, the small details of a life lived in the periphery of great events. The men listened with an intensity that showed they weren't just hearing her words, they were absorbing the fact of her existence. As the sun rose higher over the peaks, casting long shadows across the base, the time for her departure finally arrived. The transport helicopter was spooling up on the landing pad, its rhythmic thrumming vibrating through the ground. She gathered her gear, the heavy rifle case, and the canvas bag with the letter in the front pocket. She walked out to the pad, and this time the entire base seemed to have gathered. It wasn't a formal formation, but a spontaneous assembly of people who wanted to see her off. Cross was there at the edge of the pad. He didn't say much, just a firm handshake and a look that conveyed everything the official report might never be allowed to say. He told her to stay safe, and she told him the same. As she boarded the helicopter and the door began to slide shut, she looked out at the faces of the men. She saw them saluting, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The helicopter lifted off, banking away from the ridgeline and heading toward the horizon. Looking down at the shrinking base, she felt a strange, new sensation. The weight she had carried for 11 years was still there, the memories of 26 operations and the lives she had taken and saved. But it felt different now. It was no longer a burden she had to bear in total silence. She had left a record behind, not just in a folder on a commander's desk, but in the minds of the people who remained on that mountain. She was no longer just a ghost. She was Alexandra Reyes, and for the first time that was enough. The mountains passed beneath the aircraft, their jagged peaks white with snow. The war would continue, the missions would keep coming, and the bureaucracy would likely continue to do what it did best, obscuring the truth in the name of security. But the truth was a stubborn thing. It lived in the notes written by 22-year-old soldiers, in the signatures of veterans who had seen the impossible, and in the quiet resolve of a commander who refused to let a name be forgotten. As the helicopter flew into the vastness of the Afghan sky, the woman inside closed her eyes, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt at peace with the shadows. The mess hall at FOB Rhino was a place defined by its sensory monotony. It was a landscape of flickering fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency just high enough to be irritating, and the omnipresent, slightly acidic smell of coffee that had been sitting on the burner for 3 hours too long. It was a room designed for utility, a place to consume calories and move on. But that afternoon, the atmosphere inside the room had shifted. The physical space remained the same, the scarred plastic tables, the stained tile floors, the humming refrigerators, but the people within it had changed. And as any seasoned operator knows, when the people in a room change, the room itself is fundamentally altered. Every man involved in the operation was there. It wasn't a formal briefing, and no one had issued an order to assemble. It was something more primal, an organic gathering around a central point of gravity. All 12 operators were present, sitting in various states of exhaustion and reflection. Cross was there, his usual commanding presence tempered by a quiet thoughtfulness. Reed sat near the end of one table, his eyes tired but sharp. Kowalsski, Cole, and Garrett were clustered together, while 3 other support personnel, people who hadn't been on the ridgeline but had felt the ripples of the mission in the ops center, stood near the back. There was no seating chart. No one had arranged the chairs in a hierarchy. They simply gathered the way people do when they recognize they are part of something that matters, something that doesn't need a label or a slide deck to justify its existence. When Alex walked in, the room didn't erupt in applause. It didn't go silent with the dramatic flourish of a movie scene. Instead, the moderate hum of low-level conversation simply tapered off into nothing. It was a natural quieting, the kind of stillness that occurs when a room recognizes someone of significance and adjusts itself accordingly. It was the silence of respect, earned in the dirt and the dark. Cross didn't stand, but he gestured toward the empty seat beside him. It was a simple movement, yet it carried the weight of an invitation into a brotherhood that had, until 48 hours ago, been closed to her. She sat down, and for the next 2 hours, something happened at FOB Rhino that would never find its way into a mission report. It wouldn't be recorded in the official logs of the 160th SOAR or the SEAL teams. It would never be classified because, in the eyes of the institution, it never happened. No medals were pinned, and no citations were read. But every person in that room would remember those 2 hours for the rest of their lives with a clarity that the official documents would never achieve. They didn't talk about the tactical nuances of the 1,600-meter shot, nor did they dissect the extraction timing. Instead, they talked about the years. They talked about the vast, echoing gap between what actually happens in the shadows and what gets recorded in the light. They spoke of the specific, heavy loneliness of doing things that the world is never allowed to know you did. They talked about the military, not as a collection of acronyms and budgets, but as a living, breathing institution that they all loved in that complicated, bruised way you love something that has cost you a piece of your soul. They spoke of the times the system had failed the people inside it, not in dramatic or public ways, but in the steady, cumulative erosion of the spirit that happens when you are treated as a tool rather than a person. The dam broke when Moss set down his coffee cup. He looked at Alex across the table, his expression unreadable but his eyes focused. He told her he wanted to know something, and he made it clear she didn't have to answer. He asked her what it was like the first time. Not the first time she fired a rifle, but the first time she completed a high-stakes operation and realized that no one would ever know. The table fell into a profound silence. The only sound was the distant drone of a generator outside. Alex looked at her coffee, then up at Moss. She wasn't looking for a way to evade the question. She was searching for the words to describe an interior experience that had been her only companion for over a decade. She began slowly. She told them that the first time, back in Iraq when she was only 23, she had lied to herself. She had told herself that the recognition didn't matter, that the only thing that carried weight was the outcome, the people who got to go home to their families because of her. She paused, and the silence in the mess hall felt like it was pressing against the walls. She admitted that while that sentiment was true, it was also incomplete. She described standing on a ridgeline in the Iraqi desert, a ghost in the machine, knowing she had just saved lives. And then she described the walk back into the wire, where no one looked at her any differently than they had when she left to get a bottle of water. You learn to carry that, she told them, but the carrying does something to you over time. It takes up space. Garrett, the youngest among them, asked the question that was hanging in the air. He asked it with the genuine hunger of someone who was just beginning his journey and wanted to understand the cost before he was too deep to change course. He asked what kind of space it took up. Alex looked at him, seeing the youth and the potential in his face. She told him it takes up the space you might have used for other things. Trust, openness, the fundamental part of a human being that believes the recognition of others actually matters. You start to compress that part of yourself, she explained. You tell yourself you don't need it, and eventually the compression works. It does the job it's supposed to do, but it has a cost. It's a weight that never leaves you even when you're off the clock. Webb asked if she had ever thought about stopping. Alex didn't answer immediately. This wasn't a scripted debrief. It was a confession. She told them about the 14th operation, a mission in Syria. It had gone perfectly because for her the alternative was never an option. During the debrief, she sat in the back of the room while an officer pointed at a board. There was a category labeled Key Resources Deployed. Her name wasn't there. Instead, there was a designation, a string of alphanumeric characters next to photographs of operators who were alive because she had been on the glass. She looked at her hands as she recounted that moment. She told the room how she had sat there and wondered if it stopped tomorrow, would anyone actually know? Not that the missions wouldn't get done, someone else would be put in the chair, but would anyone know that a specific person with a specific name had sat there and done the work? That, she said, was the moment it got hard. Cross had been listening with the intensity of a man who was realizing he had been blind to a whole category of service. He asked what kept her going. She looked him directly in the eye and told him it was simply the next mission. There was always a next mission, and there were always people who needed what she could do. She explained that she wasn't capable of knowing that someone's life depended on her skill and choosing not to act because the institution didn't acknowledge her correctly. She was careful to clarify that it wasn't a noble quality or a sign of superior strength. It was just how she was built. She couldn't leave a problem unsolved when she held the solution in her hands. Reed, who had been a silent anchor at the table, finally spoke up. He told her that what she was describing was exactly what strength looked like. He pushed back against her modesty, telling her that the inability to walk away when the system is failing you isn't a quirk, it's character. He looked around the room, acknowledging that everyone there had met people who lacked that fire, people who made different, easier choices when the recognition stopped flowing. The table absorbed his words. It was a moment of collective realization. They weren't just looking at a great shooter, they were looking at the purest form of their own creed. Kowalski had been sitting at the far end of the table for an hour, saying nothing. He had been nursing a cold cup of coffee, his body language tense, like a man building the internal architecture required to perform a difficult task. When he finally set his cup down, the clink of ceramic on plastic sounded like a gunshot. He told the room he had something to say, not just to Alex, but to everyone. He accounted for his behavior when she first arrived. He spoke about the clipboard, the dismissive comments, and the snap judgment he had made in the first 4 seconds of meeting her. He had apologized to her in private, but he insisted on doing it in front of the team because his insult had been public. His voice was steady, but there was a tightening in his words that revealed the cost of his honesty. He admitted he was wrong in every possible direction, wrong about her, wrong about his own thought process, and wrong about the metrics he used to evaluate human beings. "I'm not going to be that wrong again," he promised. The silence that followed was a rare kind of quiet. It wasn't uncomfortable, it was the stillness that follows a moment of absolute truth. Moss nodded and said, "Same." Webb echoed him. One by one, the operators around the table acknowledged the same failure of perception. Cross brought it home. He told them that this was the lesson that mattered more than the mission or the base. He spoke about the habit of the 30-second evaluation, the way we dismiss people before we've seen what they can do. He pointed out that the cost of being wrong in that habit is never borne by the person doing the dismissing. It's borne by the person being dismissed. He looked at Alex and acknowledged that she had been paying for their collective mistakes for 11 years. The room was heavy with the weight of that admission. Alex looked around the table. She saw Reed's complex expression, Garrett's focused attention, and the rigid, respectful posture of the young soldiers like Cole. She told them that she wanted to say something, and the room gave her the silence she needed. She chose her words with the same surgical precision she used to dial in a scope. She admitted that she had spent 11 years being practical, working within the structure, and telling herself the mission was enough. But sitting there, in that mess hall, she confessed that those 2 hours of conversation meant more to her than she had ever allowed herself to expect. She clarified that she wasn't talking about the salute or the formal recognition. She was talking about the fact that Moss had asked her what it was like. In 11 years and 26 operations, no one had ever asked her what the experience was like for her. She told Moss that his question had cost him nothing to ask, but it meant more than she could properly account for. Moss's jaw set, and his eyes betrayed an emotion that a hardened operator would never put into words, but everyone in the room felt it. He told her he should have asked it sooner. They all should have. By 1100 hours, the gathering ended as organically as it had begun. There was no formal dismissal. People simply stood up, stretched, and began to move back into the rhythms of the day. But the movement was different. The interactions were more honest, the eye contact longer. The invisible wall that had existed between the regular operators and the ghost had vanished, replaced by a settled, quiet respect. As Alex headed for the door, Garrett caught up to her. He told her he wanted to say one more thing in person. He noted that she knew his name before they had ever spoken because she took people seriously before they gave her a reason to. He admitted he hadn't done that for her, and he promised that the standard she set, taking someone seriously before they've proven themselves, was the standard he would hold himself to from that day forward. Alex looked at the 22-year-old, seeing the absolute sincerity in his eyes. She told him he was going to be good at the job. When he asked, "At what?" she told him the whole job, not just the tactical parts, but the human ones. Garrett stood still for a long moment, then nodded and stepped aside to let her pass. At 1400 hours, the official machinery of the military finally hummed into motion. Cross received the response to his formal objection. He read it once, then again. He called Reed into his office and handed him the document. Reed's eyes moved quickly across the page, then slowed down as he processed the implications. The military had decided to classify the engagement record. The 1,600-meter shot, the history in Syria, any connection between Alex's name and specific mission outcomes, all of it was being buried under layers of high-level classification. Reed's jaw tightened as he realized she was getting the recognition, but the world would never know. Cross pointed him to the third paragraph. There was a new development. The program was being expanded. 3 additional operators were to be recruited and trained, and Alex was being named the program lead. She would have an official, acknowledged role. It wasn't full justice, and it didn't erase the 11 years of anonymity, but it meant her name would be on the record as the architect of the next generation. It was a victory, however compromised. Cross found Alex at the firing range later that afternoon. She wasn't shooting, she was performing detailed maintenance on her rifle. The weapon was stripped down, parts laid out in a perfect, logical order on the bench. She didn't do this because she had to, but because order was the way her mind functioned. Cross sat on the bench and told her everything, the classification, the decoration that would live in a locked file, and the training mandate. Alex listened in silence. She didn't look up from the firing pin she was cleaning. When he finished, she asked if the operators she would be training would know the true history of the program. Cross told her that, as the program lead, that was her decision to make. Alex nodded. A different kind of calculation was happening behind her eyes now, not one of windage and elevation, but one of legacy. She said they would know everything. They needed to understand the whole picture, especially the parts that aren't in the official records. Cross looked at her with an expression that moved past professional courtesy. He told her he was glad she was here. He wasn't just talking about the 3 hostages or his men coming home. He told her he was glad the base had to reckon with her, that they were put in a position where they had to look at themselves. We needed it, he admitted. Alex held his gaze for a long time before replying that she had needed it too, more than she knew. At 1600 hours, she found Reed at the perimeter wire. It was the same spot where they had stood days before, a boundary between the structured world of the base and the wild, unpredictable mountains beyond. They stood in the cold for a moment, watching the light change over the peaks. Reed told her she'd be good at the training role. Alex didn't deflect, she simply agreed. She spoke about the future, about how the people she trained would know things she hadn't known when she started. They would know how to do the work without losing the parts of themselves that needed to survive it. Reed looked at her and said, "You didn't lose them, those parts." Alex was quiet, admitting that some of those parts took a long time to find again. She thanked him for the conversation in the common area at 0300, for the map, and for the way he had treated her like a colleague once the initial friction had passed. Reed told her she had set a standard on that ridgeline that would stay at FOB Rhino long after she left. People would measure themselves against it. The wind picked up, cutting through the layers of their gear. Above the mountains, the thick cloud cover was finally starting to fracture, letting through thin columns of pale light that illuminated distant patches of the valley. Reed told her he'd be at the gate for her departure at 0600. When she looked at him, he clarified it wasn't for ceremony. He just wanted to be there. Friday morning arrived with the biting, pre-dawn chill typical of the Afghan highlands. FOB Rhino was operating at its usual early morning tempo, the low hum of generators, the distant sound of boots on gravel, the smell of diesel. Alex stepped out of the accommodation block at 0548. She carried her rifle case and her canvas bag with the same purposeful, rhythmic gait she'd had upon her arrival. But as she walked toward the gate, the meaning of that walk had changed for everyone watching. It was no longer the walk of an outsider. It was the walk of a master of her craft. As she neared the gate, she realized Reed wasn't the only one there. Cross was standing at the front, flanked by Webb, Moss, Ockhafer, Cole, and Garrett, and behind them a larger group had formed. There were 31 people in total: operators, mechanics, intel officers, and support staff. They weren't in a formal formation, but they were arranged with a specific, organic intentionality. They had all gotten out of their racks in the dark and the cold because they weren't willing to let her leave without a sign. Alex stopped at the edge of the group and looked at them. She saw the faces she had memorized from files, now transformed into real people with whom she shared a history. Garrett met her eyes from the back and gave her a small, serious nod. Kowalski stood at the front, his posture rigid and formal, his eyes conveying a depth of respect that his previous words had only begun to touch. Cross stepped forward and raised his hand. The salute he gave her at 0551 hours was different from the one on the landing pad. That first salute had been a visceral reaction to a miracle. This one was a choice. It was a deliberate acknowledgement of her entire 11-year journey. It was a statement that said, "We see you." One by one, 31 hands went up in the pre-dawn darkness. The woman who had been laughed at and dismissed when she arrived stood in the cold and finally received the weight of the debt she was owed. She returned the salute, a sharp, perfect movement. Then she picked up her bags and walked through the gate. She didn't look back. It wasn't out of coldness, but because her mind was already moving toward the next horizon. She was 34 years old, and she knew there would always be another ridgeline, another valley, and another problem that only she could solve. She would keep doing it, not for the salutes or the reports, but because the world was full of dark places, and she was one of the few who could see through the shadows. The helicopter rose into the air at 0614, banking east toward Bagram. The men at the gate watched the blinking lights of the transport until they were swallowed by the vastness of the sky. The horizon was beginning to turn that deep, bruised blue that precedes the dawn. The day was coming, indifferent and steady. Reed stayed at the gate long after the others had drifted back to their duties. He thought about the operations that were still hidden in the folders, the missions in Syria, Iraq, and places he couldn't name. He thought about the people who were walking around today, living their lives, completely unaware that their existence was owed to a woman they would never meet. He thought about the cost a system pays when it hides its best assets, and the even greater cost those assets pay when they are forced to live as ghosts. Behind him, the base was fully awake now. The ordinary machinery of war was grinding forward. But beneath the surface, the foundations of FOB Rhino had been permanently altered. Garrett came to stand beside him, his eyes fixed on the empty sky where the helicopter had disappeared. He repeated what Alex had told him, that he was going to be good at the human part of the job. Reed told him he already was, but Garrett insisted he was going to work to deserve that praise. They stood there until the first rays of sunlight broke over the jagged peaks, flooding the valley with a harsh, golden light. From that day forward, the culture of the base was different. No one made the mistake of judging a person by their arrival or their appearance. They had learned that the deadliest person in the room isn't usually the one making the most noise. Sometimes, she arrives in a dusty truck with a canvas bag and eyes that have seen everything the world tried to hide. And they realized that the only question that truly matters is whether you are wise enough to see her before she has to prove you wrong.